Chapter 91 of The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Mother and Son. The Count of Monte Cristo bowed to the 5 young men with a melancholy and dignified smile, and got into his carriage with Maximilian and Emmanuel. Albert, Beauchamp, and Château remained alone. Albert looked at his 2 friends, not timidly, but in a way that appeared to ask their opinion of what he had just done. "Indeed, my dear friend," said Beauchamp first, who had either the most feeling or the least dissimulation, "allow me to congratulate you. This is a very unhoped-for conclusion of a very disagreeable affair." Albert remained silent and wrapped in thought. Château Renaud contented himself with tapping his boot with his flexible cane. "Are we not going?" said he, after this embarrassing silence. "When you please," replied Beauchamp. "Allow me only to compliment Monsieur de Morcerf, who has given proof today of rare chivalric generosity." "Oh, yes," said Château Renaud. "It is magnificent," continued Beauchamp, "to be able to exercise so much self-control." "Assuredly. As for me, I should have been incapable of it," said Château Renaud, with most significant coolness. "Gentlemen," interrupted Albert, "I think you did not understand that something very serious had passed between Monsieur de Monte Cristo and myself." "Possibly, said Beauchamp immediately. "But every simpleton would not be able to understand your heroism, and sooner or later you will find yourself compelled to explain it to them more energetically than would be convenient to your bodily health and the duration of your life. May I give you a friendly counsel? Set out for Naples, The Hague, or St. Petersburg, calm countries, where the point of honour is better understood than among our hot-headed Parisians. Seek quietude and oblivion, so that you may return peaceably to France after a few years. Am I not right, Monsieur de Château-Renaud?" "That is quite my opinion," said the gentleman. "Nothing induces serious duels so much as a duel forsworn." "Thank you, gentlemen," replied Albert with a smile of indifference. "I shall follow your advice, not because you give it, but because I had before intended to quit France. I thank you equally for the service you have rendered me in being my seconds. It is deeply engraved on my heart, and after what you have just said, I remember that only." Château Renaud and Beauchamp looked at each other. The impression was the same on both of them, and the tone on which Morcerf had just expressed his thanks was so determined that the position would have become embarrassing for all if the conversation had continued. "Good-bye, Albert," said Beauchamp suddenly, carelessly extending his hand to the young man. The latter did not appear to arouse from his lethargy. In fact, he did not notice the offered hand. "Good-bye," said Château Renaud in his turn, keeping his little cane in his left hand and saluting with his right. Albert's lips scarcely whispered, "Good-bye." But his look was more explicit. It expressed a whole poem of restrained anger, proud disdain, and generous indignation. He preserved his melancholy and motionless position for some time after his 2 friends had regained their carriage. Then suddenly, unfastening his horse from the little tree to which his servant had tied it, he mounted and galloped off in the direction of Paris. In a quarter of an hour he was entering the house in the Rue du Helder. As he alighted, he thought he saw his father's pale face behind the curtain of the Count's bedroom. Albert turned away his head with a sigh, and went to his own apartments. He cast one lingering look on all the luxuries which had rendered life so easy and so happy since his infancy. He looked at the pictures, whose faces seemed to smile, and the landscapes which appeared painted in brighter colours. Then he took away his mother's portrait, with its oaken frame, leaving the gilt frame from which he took it black and empty. Then he arranged all his beautiful Turkish arms, his fine English guns, his Japanese china, his cups mounted in silver, his artistic bronzes by Foucher and Barye, examined the cupboards, and placed the key in each, threw into a drawer of his secretary, which he left open, all the pocket money he had about him, and with it the 1,000 fancy jewels from his vases and his jewel boxes. Then he made an exact inventory of everything, and placed it in the most conspicuous part of the table, after putting aside the books and papers which had collected there. At the beginning of this work, his servant, notwithstanding orders to the contrary, came to his room. "What do you want?" asked he with a more sorrowful than angry tone. "Pardon me, sir," replied the valet. "You had forbidden me to disturb you, but the Count of Morcerf has called me." "Well?" said Albert. "I did not like to go to him without first seeing you." "Why?" "Because the Count is doubtless aware that I accompanied you to the meeting this morning." "It is probable," said Albert. "And since he has sent for me, it is doubtless to question me on what happened there. What must I answer?" "The truth." "Then I shall say the duel did not take place?" "You will say I apologized to the Count of Monte Cristo. Go." The valet bowed and retired, and Albert returned to his inventory. As he was finishing this work, the sound of horses prancing in the yard and the wheels of a carriage shaking his window attracted his attention. He approached the window and saw his father get into it and drive away. The door was scarcely closed when Albert bent his steps to his mother's room, and no one being there to announce him, he advanced to her bedchamber, and, distressed by what he saw and guessed, stopped for one moment at the door. As if the same idea had animated these two beings, Mercédès was doing the same in her apartments that he had just done in his. Everything was in order: laces, dresses, jewels, linen, money. All were arranged in the drawers, and the Countess was carefully collecting the keys. Albert saw all these preparations, and understood them, and exclaiming, "My mother!" he threw his arms around her neck. The artists who could have depicted the expression of these two countenances would certainly have made them a beautiful picture. All these proofs of an energetic resolution, which Albert did not fear on his own account, alarmed him for his mother. "What are you doing?" asked he. "What were you doing?" replied she. "Oh, my mother!" exclaimed Albert, so overcome he could scarcely speak. "It is not the same with you and me. You cannot have made the same resolution I have, for I have come to warn you that I bid adieu to your house and to you." "I also," replied Mercédès, "am going, and I acknowledge I had depended on your accompanying me, for I deceived myself." "Mother," said Albert with firmness, "I cannot make you share the fate I have planned for myself. I must live henceforth without rank and fortune, and to begin this hard apprenticeship, I must borrow from a friend the loaf I shall eat until I have earned one. So, my dear mother, I am going at once to ask France to lend me the small sum I shall require to supply my present wants." "You, my poor child, suffer poverty and hunger. Oh, do not say so. It will break my resolutions." "But not mine, mother," replied Albert. "I am young and strong. I believe I am courageous, and since yesterday I have learned the power of will. Alas, my dear mother, some have suffered so much and yet live, and have raised a new fortune on the ruin of all the promises of happiness which heaven had made them, on the fragments of all the hope which God had given them. I have seen that, mother. I know that from the gulf in which their enemies have plunged them, they have risen with so much vigor and glory that in their turn they have ruled their former conquerors and have punished them. No, mother, from this moment I have done with the past, and accept nothing from it, not even a name, because you can understand that your son cannot bear the name of a man who ought to blush for it before another." "Albert, my child," said Mercédès, "if I had a stronger heart, that is the counsel I would have given you. Your conscience has spoken when my voice became too weak. Listen to its dictates. You had friends. Albert, break off their acquaintance. But do not despair. You have life before you, my dear Albert. for you are yet scarcely 22 years old, and as a pure heart like yours wants a spotless name, take my father's. It was Herrera. I am sure, my dear Albert, whatever may be your career, you will soon render that name illustrious. Then, my son, return to the world still more brilliant because of your former sorrows. And if I am wrong, still let me cherish these hopes, for I have no future to look forward to. For me the grave opens when I pass the threshold of this house." "I will fulfill all your wishes, my dear mother," said the young man. "Yes, I share your hopes. The anger of heaven will not pursue us, since you are pure and I am innocent. But since our resolution is formed, let us act promptly. Monsieur de Morcerf went out about half an hour ago. The opportunity is favourable to avoid an explanation." "I am ready, my son," said Mercédès. Albert ran to fetch a carriage. He recollected that there was a small furnished house to let in the Rue de Saint-Père, where his mother would find a humble but decent lodging, and thither he intended conducting the Countess. As the carriage stopped at the door, and Albert was alighting, a man approached and gave him a letter. Albert recognized the bearer. "From the Count," said Bertuccio. Albert took the letter, opened and read it, then looked round for Bertuccio, but he was gone. He returned to Mercédès with tears in his eyes and heaving breast, and without uttering a word, he gave her the letter. Mercédès read: "Albert, while showing you that I have discovered your plans, I hope also to convince you of my delicacy. You are free. You leave the Count's house and you take your mother to your home. But reflect, Albert, you owe her more than your poor noble heart can pay her. Keep the struggle for yourself. Bear all the suffering, but spare her the trial of poverty which must accompany your first efforts, for she deserves not even the shadow of the misfortune which has this day fallen on her. And Providence is not willing that the innocent should suffer for the guilty. I know you are going to leave the Rue de Helder without taking anything with you. Do not seek to know how I discovered it. I know it. That is sufficient. Now listen, Albert. 24 years ago I returned proud and joyful to my country. I had a betrothed, Albert, a lovely girl whom I adored, and I was bringing to my betrothed 150 louis, painfully amassed by ceaseless toil. This money was for her. I destined it for her, and knowing the treachery of the sea, I buried our treasure in the little garden of the house my father lived in at Marseille, on the Allée de Meilhan. Your mother, Albert, knows that poor house well. A short time since I passed through Marseille, and went to see the old place, which revives so many painful recollections, and in the evening I took a spade and dug in the corner of the garden where I had concealed my treasure. The iron box was there. No one had touched it, under a beautiful fig tree my father had planted the day I was born, which overshadowed the spot. Well, Albert, this money, which was formerly designed to promote the comfort and tranquillity of the woman I adored, may now, through strange and painful circumstances, be devoted to the same purpose. Oh, feel for me, who could offer millions to that poor woman, but who return her only the piece of black bread forgotten under my poor roof since the day I was torn from her I loved. You are a generous man, Albert, but perhaps you may be blinded by pride or resentment. If you refuse me, if you ask another for what I have a right to offer you, I will say it is ungenerous of you to refuse the life of your mother at the hands of a man whose father was allowed by your father to die in all the horrors of poverty and despair. Albert stood pale and motionless to hear what his mother would decide after she had finished reading this letter. Mercédès turned her eyes with an ineffable look towards heaven. "I accept it," said she. "He has a right to pay the dowry, which I should take with me to some convent." Putting the letter in her bosom, she took her son's arm, and with a firmer step than she even herself expected, she went downstairs. End of Chapter 91. Chapter 92. The Suicide. Meanwhile, Monte Cristo had also returned to town with Emmanuel and Maximilian. Their return was cheerful. Emmanuel did not conceal his joy at the peaceful termination of the affair, and was loud in his expressions of delight. Morel, in a corner of the carriage, allowed his brother-in-law's gaiety to expend itself in words, while he felt equal inward joy, which, however, betrayed itself only in his countenance. At the Barrière du Trône they met Bertuccio, who was waiting there, motionless as a sentinel at his post. Monte Cristo put his head out of the window, exchanged a few words with him in a low tone, and the steward disappeared. "Count," said Emmanuel, when they were at the end of the Place Royale, "put me down at my door, that my wife may not have a single moment of needless anxiety on my account or yours." "If it were not ridiculous to make a display of our triumph, I would invite the Count to our house. Besides that, he doubtless has some trembling heart to comfort. So we will take leave of our friend and let him hasten home." "Stop a moment," said Monte Cristo. "Do not let me lose both my companions. Return, Emmanuel, to your charming wife, and present my best compliments to her. And do you, Morel, accompany me to the Champs-Élysées?" "Willingly," said Maximilian, "particularly as I have business in that quarter." "Shall we wait breakfast for you?" asked Emmanuel. "No," replied the young man. The door was closed, and the carriage proceeded. "See what good fortune I brought you," said Morel, when he was alone with the Count. "Have you not thought so?" "Yes," said Monte Cristo. "For that reason I wished to keep you near me." "It is miraculous," continued Morel, answering his own thoughts. "What?" said Monte Cristo. "What has just happened?" "Yes," said the Count. "You are right, it is miraculous." "For Albert is brave," resumed Morel. "Very brave," said Monte Cristo. "I have seen him sleep with a sword suspended over his head." "And I know he has fought 2 duels," said Morel. "How can you reconcile that with his conduct this morning?" "All allowing to your influence," replied Monte Cristo, smiling. "It is well for Albert he is not in the army," said Morel. "Why?" "An apology on the ground?" said the young captain, shaking his head. "Come," said the Count mildly, "do not entertain the prejudices of ordinary men. Acknowledge that if Albert is brave, he cannot be a coward. He must then have had some reason for acting as he did this morning, and confess that his conduct is more heroic than otherwise." "Doubtless, doubtless," said Morel, "but I shall say, like the Spaniard, he has not been so brave today as he was yesterday." "You will breakfast with me, will you not, Morel?" said the Count, to turn the conversation. "No, I must leave you at 10 o'clock." "Your engagement was for breakfast, then?" said the Count. Morel smiled and shook his head. "Still, you must breakfast somewhere." "But if I am not hungry?" said the young man. "Oh," said the Count, "I only know 2 things which destroy the appetite. Grief, and as I am happy to see you are very cheerful, it is not that, and love. Now, after what you told me this morning of your heart, I may believe." "Well, Count," replied Morel gaily, "I will not dispute it." "But you will not make me your confidant, Maximilian," said the Count, in a tone which showed how gladly he would have been admitted to the secret. "I showed you this morning that I had a heart, did I not, Count?" Monte Cristo only answered by extending his hand to the young man. "Well," continued the latter, "since that heart is no longer with you in the Bois de Vincennes, it is elsewhere, and I must go and find it." "Go," said the Count deliberately. "Go, dear friend, but promise me, if you meet with any obstacle, to remember that I have some power in this world, and that I am happy to use that power in the behalf of those I love, and that I love you, Morel." "I will remember it," said the young man, "as selfish children recollect their parents when they want their aid. When I need your assistance, and the moment arrives, I will come to you, Count." "Well, I rely upon your promise. Good-bye, then." "Good-bye, till we meet again." They had arrived in the Champs-Élysées. Monte Cristo opened the carriage door. Morrel sprang out on the pavement. Bertuccio was waiting on the steps. Morrel disappeared down the Avenue de Marigny, and Monte Cristo hastened to join Bertuccio. "Well?" asked he. "She is going to leave her house," said the steward. "And her son?" "Florentin, his valet, thinks he is going to do the same." "Come this way." Monte Cristo took Bertuccio into his study, wrote the letter we have seen, and gave it to the steward. "Go," said he quickly. "But first let Haydée be informed that I have returned." "Here I am," said the young girl, who at the sound of the carriage had run down the stairs, and whose face was radiant with joy at seeing the Count return safely. Bertuccio left. Every transport of a daughter finding a father, all the delight of a mistress seeing an adored lover, were felt by Haydée during the first moments of this meeting, which she had so eagerly expected. Doubtless, although less evident, Monte Cristo's joy was not less intense. Joy to hearts which have suffered long is like the dew on the ground after a long drought. Both the heart and the ground absorb that beneficent moisture falling on them, and nothing is outwardly apparent. Monte Cristo was beginning to think, what he had not for a long time dared to believe, that there were two Mercédès in the world, and he might yet be happy. His eye, elate with happiness, was reading eagerly the tearful gaze of Haydée, when suddenly the door opened. The Count knit his brow. "Monsieur de Morcerf," said Baptistin, as if that name sufficed for his excuse. In fact, the Count's face brightened. "Which?" asked he. "The Viscount or the Count?" "The Count." "Oh," exclaimed Haydée, "is it not yet over?" "I know not if it is finished, my beloved child," said Monte Cristo, taking the young girl's hands. "But I do know you have nothing more to fear." "But it is wretched." "That man cannot injure me, Haydée," said Monte Cristo. "It was his son alone that there was cause to fear." "And what I have suffered," said the young girl, "you shall never know, my lord." Monte Cristo smiled. "By my father's tomb," said he, extending his hand over the head of the young girl, "I swear to you, Haydée, that if any misfortune happens, it will not be to me." "I believe you, my lord, as implicitly as if God had spoken to me," said the young girl, presenting her forehead to him. Monte Cristo pressed on that pure, beautiful forehead a kiss which made two hearts throb at once, the one violently, the other heavily. "Oh," murmured the Count, "shall I then be permitted to love again?" "Ask Monsieur de Morcerf into the drawing-room," said he to Baptistin, while he led the beautiful Greek girl to a private staircase. We must explain this visit, which, although expected by Monte Cristo, is unexpected to our readers. While Mercédès, as we have said, was making a similar inventory of her property to Albert's, while she was arranging her jewels, shutting her drawers, collecting her keys, to leave everything in perfect order, she did not perceive a pale and sinister face at a glass door which threw light into the passage from which everything could be both seen and heard. He who was thus looking, without being heard or seen, probably heard and saw all that passed in Madame de Morcerf's apartments. From that glass door the pale-faced man went to the Count's bedroom, and raised with a constricted hand the curtain of a window overlooking the courtyard. He remained there 10 minutes, motionless and dumb, listening to the beating of his own heart. For him those 10 minutes were very long. It was then Albert, returning from his meeting with the Count, perceived his father watching for his arrival behind a curtain, and turned aside. The Count's eyes expanded. He knew Albert had insulted the Count dreadfully, and that in every country in the world such an insult would lead to a deadly duel. Albert returned safely. Then the Count was revenged. An indescribable ray of joy illumined that wretched countenance like the last ray of the sun before it disappears behind the clouds which bear the aspect, not of a downy couch, but of a tomb. But as we have said, he waited in vain for his son to come to his apartment with the account of his triumph. He easily understood why his son did not come to see him before he went to avenge his father's honour, but when that was done, why did not his son come and throw himself into his arms? It was then, when the Count could not see Albert, that he sent for his servant, who knew was authorized not to conceal anything from him. 10 minutes afterwards, General Morcerf was seen on the steps in a black coat with a military collar, black pantaloons and black gloves. He had apparently given previous orders, for as he reached the bottom step, his carriage came from the coach-house ready for him. The valet threw into the carriage his military cloak, in which 2 swords were wrapped, and shutting the door, he took his seat by the side of the coachman. The coachman stooped down for his orders. "To the Champs-Élysées," said the general. "The Count of Monte Cristo's. Hurry!" The horses bounded beneath the whip, and in 5 minutes they stopped before the Count's door. Monsieur de Morcerf opened the door himself, and as the carriage rolled away, he passed up the walk, rang, and entered the open door with his servant. A moment afterwards, Baptistin announced the Count of Morcerf to Monte Cristo, and the latter, leading Haydée aside, ordered that Morcerf be asked into the drawing-room. The general was pacing the room the 3rd time when, in turning, he perceived Monte Cristo at the door. "Ah, it is Monsieur de Morcerf," said Monte Cristo quietly. "I thought I had not heard aright." "Yes, it is I," said the Count, whom a frightful contraction of the lips prevented from articulating freely. "May I know the cause which procures me the pleasure of seeing Monsieur de Morcerf so early?" "Had you not a meeting with my son this morning?" asked the general. "I had," replied the Count. "And I know my son had good reasons to wish to fight with you, and to endeavour to kill you." "Yes, sir, he had very good ones, but you see that in spite of them he has not killed me and did not even fight." "Yet he considered you the cause of his father's dishonour, the cause of the fearful ruin which has fallen on my house." "It is true, sir," said Monte Cristo with his dreadful calmness. "A secondary cause, but not the principal." "Doubtless you made, then, some apology or explanation." "I explained nothing, and it is he who apologized to me." "But to what do you attribute this conduct?" "To the conviction, probably, that there was one more guilty than I." "And who was that?" "His father." "That may be," said the Count, turning pale, "but you know the guilty do not like to find themselves convicted." "I know it, and I expected this result." "You expected my son would be a coward?" cried the Count. "Monsieur Albert de Morcerf is no coward," said Monte Cristo. "A man who holds a sword in his hand, and sees a mortal enemy within reach of that sword, and does not fight, is a coward. Why is he not here, that I may tell him so?" "Sir," replied Monte Cristo coldly, "I did not expect that you had come here to relate to me your little family affairs. Go and tell Monsieur Albert that, and he may know what to answer you." "Oh, no, no," said the general, smiling faintly. "I did not come for that purpose. You are right. I came to tell you that I also look upon you as my enemy. I came to tell you that I hate you instinctively, that it seemed as if I had always known you and always hated you, and in short, since the young people of the present day will not fight, it remains for us to do so. Do you think so, sir?" "Certainly. And when I told you I had foreseen the result, It is the honour of your visit I alluded to. So much the better. Are you prepared? Yes, sir. You know that we shall fight till one of us is dead, said the general, whose teeth were clenched with rage. Until one of us dies, repeated Monte Cristo, moving his head slightly up and down. Let us start, then. We need no witnesses. Very true, said Monte Cristo. It is unnecessary. We know each other so well. On the contrary, said the Count, we know so little of each other. Indeed, said Monte Cristo, with the same indomitable coolness. Let us see. Are you not the soldier Fernand, who deserted on the eve of the Battle of Waterloo? Are you not the Lieutenant Fernand, who served as guide and spy to the French army in Spain? Are you not the Captain Fernand, who betrayed, sold, and murdered his benefactor Ali? And have not all these Fernands united made Lieutenant General, the Count of Morcerf, peer of France? Oh, cried the general, as if branded with a hot iron, wretch! To reproach me with my shame when about, perhaps, to kill me. No, I did not say I was a stranger to you. I know well, demon, that you have penetrated into the darkness of the past, and that you have read by the light of what torch I know not every page of my life. But perhaps I may be more honourable in my shame than you under your pompous coverings. No, I am aware you know me, but I know you only as an adventurer sewn up in gold and jewellery. You call yourself in Paris the Count of Monte Cristo, in Italy Sinbad the Sailor, in Malta I forget what, but it is your real name I want to know, in the midst of your 100 names, that I may pronounce it when we meet to fight, at the moment when I plunge my sword through your heart. The Count of Monte Cristo turned dreadfully pale. His eyes seemed to burn with a devouring fire. He leapt towards the dressing-room near his bedroom, and in less than a moment, tearing off his cravat, his coat and waistcoat, he put on a sailor's jacket and hat, from beneath which rolled his long black hair. He returned thus, formidable and implacable, advancing with his arms crossed on his breast towards the general, who could not understand why he had disappeared, but who, on seeing him again, and feeling his teeth chatter and his legs sink under him, drew back, and only stopped when he found a table to support his clenched hand. "Fernand," cried he, "of my 100 names, I need only tell you one to overwhelm you. But you guess it now, do you not? Or rather, you remember it, for notwithstanding all my sorrows and my tortures, I show you today a face which the happiness of revenge makes young again, a face you must often have seen in your dreams, since your marriage with Mercédès, my betrothed." The general, with his head thrown back, hands extended, gaze fixed, looked silently at this dreadful apparition. Then, seeking the wall to support him, he glided along close to it until he reached the door, through which he went out backwards, uttering this single, mournful, lamentable, distressing cry, "Edmond Dantès!" Then, with sighs which were unlike any human sound, he dragged himself to the door, reeled across the courtyard, and, falling into the arms of his valet, he said in a voice scarcely intelligible, "Home! Home!" The fresh air, and the shame he felt at having exposed himself before his servants, partly recalled his senses. But the ride was short, and as he drew near his house all his wretchedness revived. He stopped at a short distance from the house and alighted. The door was wide open. A hackney coach was standing in the middle of the yard, a strange sight before so noble a mansion. The Count looked at it with terror, but without daring to inquire its meaning, he rushed towards his apartment. 2 persons were coming down the stairs. He had only time to creep into an alcove to avoid them. It was Mercédès leaning on her son's arm and leaving the house. They passed close by the unhappy being, who, concealed behind the damask curtain, almost felt Mercedes's dress brush past him, and his son's warm breath pronouncing these words, "Courage, mother. Come, this is no longer our home." The words died away. The steps were lost in the distance. The general drew himself up, clinging to the curtain. He uttered the most dreadful sob which ever escaped from the bosom of a father abandoned at the same time by his wife and son. He soon heard the clatter of the iron step of the hackney coach, then the coachman's voice, and then the rolling of the heavy vehicle shook the windows. He darted to his bedroom to see once more all he had loved in the world, but the hackney coach drove on, and the head of neither Mercedes nor her son appeared at the window to take a last look at the house or the deserted father and husband. And at the very moment when the wheels of that coach crossed the gateway, a report was heard, and a thick smoke escaped through one of the panes of the window which was broken by the explosion. End of chapter 92. Chapter 93. Valentine. We may easily conceive where Morel's appointment was. On leaving Monte Cristo, he walked slowly towards Villefort. We say slowly, for Morel had more than half an hour to spare to go 500 steps. But he had hastened to take leave of Monte Cristo because he wished to be alone with his thoughts. He knew this time well, the hour when Valentine was giving Noirtier his breakfast, and was sure not to be disturbed in the performance of this pious duty. Noirtier and Valentine had given him leave to go twice a week, and he was now availing himself of that permission. He had arrived. Valentine was expecting him. Uneasy and almost crazed, she seized his hand and led him to her grandfather. This uneasiness, amounting almost to frenzy, arose from the report Morcerf's adventure had made in the world, for the affair at the opera was generally known. No one at Villefort doubted that a duel would ensue from it. Valentine, with her woman's instinct, guessed that Morel would be Monte Cristo's second, and from the young man's well-known courage and his great affection for the Count, she feared that he would not content himself with the passive part assigned to him. We may easily understand how eagerly the particulars were asked for, given, and received, and Morel could read an indescribable joy in the eyes of his beloved when she knew that the termination of this affair was as happy as it was unexpected. "Now," said Valentine, motioning to Morel to sit down near her grandfather, while she took her seat on his footstool. "Now, let us talk about our own affairs. You know, Maximilian, Grandpapa once thought of leaving this house and taking an apartment away from Monsieur de Villefort's." "Yes," said Maximilian. "I recollect the project, of which I highly approved." "Well," said Valentine, "you may approve again, for Grandpapa is again thinking of it." "Bravo!" said Maximilian. "And do you know," said Valentine, "what reason Grandpapa gives for leaving this house?" Noirtier looked at Valentine to impose silence, but she did not notice him. Her looks, her eyes, her smile were all for Morel. "Oh, whatever may be Monsieur Noirtier's reason," answered Morel, "I can readily believe it to be a good one." "An excellent one," said Valentine. "He pretends the air of the Faubourg Saint-Honoré is not good for me." "Indeed?" said Morel. "In that Monsieur Noirtier may be right. You have not seemed to be well for the last fortnight." "Not very," said Valentine. "And Grandpapa has become my physician, and I have the greatest confidence in him, because he knows everything." "Do you then really suffer?" asked Morel quickly. "Oh, it must not be called suffering. I feel a general uneasiness, that is all. I have lost my appetite, and my stomach feels as if it were struggling to get accustomed to something." Noirtier did not lose a word of what Valentine said. "And what treatment do you adopt for this singular complaint?" "A very simple one," said Valentine. "I swallow every morning a spoonful of the mixture prepared for my grandfather. When I say one spoonful, I began by one. Now I take 4. Grandpapa says it is a panacea." Valentine smiled, but it was evident that she suffered. Maximilian, in his devotedness, gazed silently at her. She was very beautiful, but her usual pallor had increased. Her eyes were more brilliant than ever, and her hands, which were generally white, like mother of pearl, now more resembled wax, to which time was adding a yellowish hue. From Valentine, the young man looked towards Noirtier. The latter watched with strange and deep interest the young girl, absorbed by her affection, and he also, like Morel, followed those traces of inward suffering which was so little perceptible to a common observer, that they escaped the notice of every one but the grandfather and the lover. "But," said Morel, "I thought this mixture of which you now take 4 spoonfuls was prepared for Monsieur Noirtier." "I know it is very bitter," said Valentine, "so bitter that all I drink afterwards appears to have the same taste." Noirtier looked inquiringly at his granddaughter. "Yes, grandpapa," said Valentine, "it is so. Just now, before I came down to you, I drank a glass of sugar water. I left half, because it seemed so bitter." Noirtier turned pale, and made a sign that he wished to speak. Valentine rose to fetch the dictionary. Noirtier watched her with evident anguish. In fact, the blood was rushing to the young girl's head already. Her cheeks were becoming red. "Oh!" cried she, without losing any of her cheerfulness, "this is singular. I can't see. Did the sun shine in my eyes?" And she leaned against the window. "The sun is not shining," said Morel, more alarmed by Noirtier's expression than by Valentine's indisposition. He ran towards her. The young girl smiled. "Cheer up," she said to Noirtier. "Do not be alarmed, Maximilian. It is nothing, and has already passed away. But listen, do I not hear a carriage in the courtyard?" She opened Noirtier's door, ran to a window in the passage, and returned hastily. "Yes," said she, "it is Madame Danglars and her daughter, who have come to call on us. Good-bye, I must run away, for they would send here for me, or rather, farewell till I see you again. Stay with grandpapa, Maximilian. I promise you not to persuade them to stay." Morel watched her as she left the room. He heard her ascend the little staircase, which led both to Madame de Villefort's apartments and to hers. As soon as she was gone, Noirtier made a sign to Morel to take the dictionary. Morel obeyed. Guided by Valentine, he had learned how to understand the old man quickly. Accustomed, however, as he was to the work, he had to repeat most of the letters of the alphabet, and to find every word in the dictionary, so that it was 10 minutes before the thought of the old man was translated by these words: "Fetch the glass of water and the decanter from Valentine's room." Morel rang immediately for the servant who had taken Barrois's situation, and in Noirtier's name gave that order. The servant soon returned. The decanter and the glass were completely empty. Noirtier made a sign that he wished to speak. "Why are the glass and decanter empty?" asked he. "Valentine said she only drank half the glassful." The translation of this new question occupied another 5 minutes. "I do not know," said the servant, "but the housemaid is in Mademoiselle Valentine's room. Perhaps she has emptied them." "Ask her," said Morel, translating Noirtier's thought this time by his look. The servant went out, but returned almost immediately. "Mademoiselle Valentine passed through the room to go to Madame de Villefort's," said he, "and in passing, as she was thirsty, she drank what remained in the glass. As for the decanter, Master Edward had emptied that to make a pond for his ducks." Noirtier raised his eyes to heaven, as a gambler does who stakes his all on one stroke. From that moment the old man's eyes were fixed on the door, and did not quit it. It was indeed Madame Danglars and her daughter whom Valentine had seen. They had been ushered into Madame de Villefort's room, who had said she would receive them there. That is why Valentine passed through her room, which was on a level with Valentine's and only separated from it by Edward's. The two ladies entered the drawing-room with that sort of official stiffness which preludes a formal communication. Among worldly people, manner is contagious. Madame de Villefort received them with equal solemnity. Valentine entered at this moment, and the formalities were resumed. "My dear friend," said the Baroness, while the two young people were shaking hands, "I and Eugenie are come to be the first to announce to you the approaching marriage of my daughter with the Prince Cavalcanti." Danglars kept up the title of Prince. The popular banker found that it answered better than Count. "Allow me to present to you my sincere congratulations," replied Madame de Villefort. "Prince Cavalcanti appears to be a young man of rare qualities." "Listen," said the Baroness, smiling. "Speaking to you as a friend, I can say that the prince does not yet appear all he will be. He has about him a little of that foreign manner by which French persons recognize at first sight the Italian or German nobleman. Besides, he gives evidence of a great kindness of disposition, much keenness of wit, and as to suitability, Monsieur Danglars assures me that his fortune is majestic. That is his word." "And then," said Eugenie, while turning over the leaves of Madame de Villefort's album, "add that you have taken a great fancy to the young man." "And," said Madame de Villefort, "I need not ask you if you share that fancy." "I?" replied Eugenie with her usual candour. "Oh, not the least in the world, madame. My wish was not to confine myself to domestic cares, or the caprice of any man, but to be an artist, and consequently free in heart, in person, and in thought." Eugenie pronounced these words with so firm a tone that the colour mounted to Valentine's cheeks. The timid girl could not understand that vigorous nature which appeared to have none of the timidities of woman. "At any rate," said she, "since I am to be married whether I will or not, I ought to be thankful to Providence for having released me from my engagement with Monsieur Albert de Morcerf, or I should this day have been the wife of a dishonoured man." "It is true," said the Baroness, with that strange simplicity sometimes met with among fashionable ladies, and of which plebeian intercourse can never entirely deprive them. "It is very true that had not the Morcerfs hesitated, my daughter would have married Monsieur Albert. The General depended much on it. He even came to force Monsieur Danglars. We have had a narrow escape." "But," said Valentine timidly, "does all the father's shame revert upon the son? Monsieur Albert appears to me quite innocent of the treason charged against the General." "Excuse me," said the implacable young girl. "Monsieur Albert claims and well deserves his share. It appears that after having challenged Monsieur de Monte Cristo at the opera yesterday, he apologized on the ground today." "Impossible," said Madame de Villefort. "Ah, my dear friend," said Madame Danglars, with the same simplicity we before noticed, "it is a fact. I heard it from Monsieur Debray, who was present at the explanation." Valentine also knew the truth, but she did not answer. A single word had reminded her that Morel was expecting her in Monsieur Noirtier's room. Deeply engaged with a sort of inward contemplation, Valentine had ceased for a moment to join in the conversation. She would, indeed, have found it impossible to repeat what had been said the last few minutes, when suddenly Madame Danglars' hand pressed on her arm, arousing her from her lethargy. "What is it?" said she, starting at Madame Danglars' touch, as she would have done from an electric shock. "It is, my dear Valentine," said the Baroness, "that you are doubtless suffering." "I?" said the young girl, passing her hand across her burning forehead. "Yes, look at yourself in that glass. You have turned pale and then red successively, 3 or 4 times in 1 minute." "Indeed," cried Eugenie, "you are very pale." "Oh, do not be alarmed. I have been so for many days." Artless as she was, the young girl knew that this was an opportunity to leave, and besides, Madame de Villefort came to her assistance. "Retire, Valentine," said she. "You are really suffering, and these ladies will excuse you. Drink a glass of pure water. It will restore you." Valentine kissed Eugenie, bowed to Madame Danglars, who had already risen to take her leave, and went out. "That poor child," said Madame de Villefort, when Valentine was gone. "She makes me very uneasy, and I should not be astonished if she had some serious illness." Meanwhile, Valentine, in a sort of excitement which she could not quite understand, had crossed Edward's room without noticing some trick of the child, and through her own had reached the little staircase. She was within 3 steps of the bottom. She already heard Morel's voice, when suddenly a cloud passed over her eyes. Her stiffened foot missed the step. Her hands had no power to hold the baluster, and falling against the wall, she lost her balance wholly and toppled to the floor. Morel bounded to the door, opened it, and found Valentine stretched out at the bottom of the stairs. Quick as a flash, he raised her in his arms and placed her in a chair. Valentine opened her eyes. "Oh, what a clumsy thing I am," said she with feverish volubility. "I don't know my way. I forgot where there were 3 more steps before the landing." "You have hurt yourself, perhaps," said Morel. "What can I do for you, Valentine?" Valentine looked around her. She saw the deepest terror depicted in Noirtier's eyes. "Don't worry, dear grandpapa," said she, endeavouring to smile. "It is nothing. It is nothing. I was giddy, that is all." "Another attack of giddiness?" said Morel, clasping his hands. "Oh, attend to it, Valentine, I entreat you." "But no," said Valentine. "No, I tell you it is all past, and it was nothing. Now let me tell you some news. Eugenie is to be married in a week, and in 3 days there is to be a grand feast, a betrothal festival. We are all invited, my father, Madame de Villefort, and I. At least, I understood it so." "When will it be our turn to think of these things? Oh, Valentine, you who have so much influence over your grandpapa, try to make him answer soon." "And do you," said Valentine, "depend on me to stimulate the tardiness and arouse the memory of grandpapa?" "Yes," cried Morel. "Make haste. So long as you are not mine, Valentine, I shall always think I may lose you." "Oh," replied Valentine with a convulsive movement. "Oh, indeed, Maximilian, you are too timid for an officer, for a soldier who, they say, never knows fear." She burst into a forced and melancholy laugh. Her arms stiffened and twisted, her head fell back on her chair, and she remained motionless. The cry of terror which was stopped on Noirtier's lips seemed to start from his eyes. Morel understood it. He knew he must call assistance. The young man rang the bell violently. The housemaid, who had been in Mademoiselle Valentine's room, and the servant, who had replaced Barrois, ran in at the same moment. Valentine was so pale, so cold, so inanimate, that without listening to what was said to them, they were seized with the fear which pervaded that house, and they flew into the passage, crying for help. Madame Danglars and Eugenie were going out at the moment. They heard the cause of the disturbance. "I told you so," exclaimed Madame de Villefort. "Poor child!" End of chapter 93. Chapter 94. Maximilian's Avowal. At the same moment, Monsieur de Villefort's voice was heard calling from his study. "What is the matter?" Morel looked at Noirtier, who had recovered his self-command, and with a glance indicated the closet where once before, under somewhat similar circumstances, he had taken refuge. He had only time to get his hat and throw himself breathless into the closet when the procureur's footstep was heard in the passage. Villefort sprang into the room, ran to Valentine, and took her in his arms. A physician, Monsieur d'Avrigny," replied Villefort. "Or rather, I will go for him myself." He flew from the apartment, and Morel, at the same moment, darted out at the other door. He had been struck to the heart by a frightful recollection. The conversation he had heard between the doctor and Villefort the night of Madame de Saint-Méran's death recurred to him. These symptoms, to a less alarming extent, were the same which had preceded the death of Barrois. At the same time, Monte Cristo's voice seemed to resound in his ear with the words he had heard only 2 hours before. "Whatever you want, Morel, come to me. I have great power." More rapidly than thought, he darted down the Rue Matignon and thence to the Avenue des Champs-Élysées. Meanwhile, Monsieur de Villefort arrived in a hired cabriolet at Monsieur d'Avrigny's door. He rang so violently that the porter was alarmed. Villefort ran upstairs without saying a word. The porter knew him, and let him pass, only calling to him, "In his study, Monsieur Procureur, in his study." Villefort pushed, or rather forced, the door open. "Ah," said the doctor, "is it you?" "Yes," said Villefort, closing the door after him. "It is I, who am come in my turn to ask you if we are quite alone. Doctor, my house is accursed." "What?" said the latter with apparent coolness, but with deep emotion. "Have you another invalid?" "Yes, doctor," cried Villefort, clutching his hair. "Yes." D'Avrigny's look implied, "I told you it would be so." Then he slowly uttered these words, "Who is now dying in your house? What new victim is going to accuse you of weakness before God?" A mournful sob burst from Villefort's heart. He approached the doctor, and seizing his arm, "Valentine," said he, "it is Valentine's turn." "Your daughter?" cried d'Avrigny with grief and surprise. "You see, you were deceived," murmured the magistrate. "Come and see her, and on her bed of agony entreat her pardon for having suspected her." "Each time you have applied to me," said the doctor, "it has been too late. Still, I will go. But let us make haste, sir. With the enemies you have to do with, there is no time to be lost." "Oh, this time, doctor, you shall not have to reproach me with weakness. This time I will know the assassin, and will pursue him." "Let us try first to save the victim before we think of revenging her," said d'Avrigny. "Come." The same cabriolet which had brought Villefort took them back at full speed, and at this moment Morel rapped at Monte Cristo's door. The Count was in his study, and was reading with an angry look something which Bertuccio had brought him in haste. Hearing the name of Morel, who had left him only 2 hours before, the Count raised his head, arose, and sprang to meet him. "What is the matter, Maximilian?" asked he. "You are pale, and the perspiration rolls from your forehead." Morel fell into a chair. "Yes," said he, "I came quickly. I wanted to speak to you." "Are all your family well?" asked the Count with an affectionate benevolence, whose sincerity no one could for a moment doubt. "Thank you, Count, thank you," said the young man, evidently embarrassed how to begin the conversation. "Yes, every one in my family is well." "So much the better. Yet you have something to tell me," replied the Count with increased anxiety. "Yes," said Morel, "it is true. I have but now left a house where death has just entered, to run to you." "Are you then come from Monsieur de Morcerf's?" asked Monte Cristo. "No," said Morel. "Is someone dead in his house?" "The General has just blown his brains out," replied Monte Cristo with great coolness. "Oh, what a dreadful event!" cried Maximilian. "Not for the Countess or for Albert," said Monte Cristo. "A dead father or husband is better than a dishonoured one. Blood washes out shame." "Poor Countess," said Maximilian. "I pity her very much. She is so noble a woman." "Pity Albert also, Maximilian, for believe me he is the worthy son of the Countess. But let us return to yourself. You have hastened to me. Can I have the happiness of being useful to you?" "Yes, I need your help. That is, I thought like a madman that you could lend me your assistance in a case where God alone can succour me." "Tell me what it is," replied Monte Cristo. "Oh," said Morel, "I know not, indeed, if I may reveal this secret to mortal ears, but fatality impels me, necessity constrains me, Count." Morel hesitated. "Do you think I love you?" said Monte Cristo, taking the young man's hand affectionately in his. Oh, you encourage me, and something tells me there," placing his hand on his heart, "that I ought to have no secret from you." "You are right, Morel. God is speaking to your heart, and your heart speaks to you. Tell me what it says." "Count, will you allow me to send Baptistin to inquire after someone you know?" "I am at your service, and still more my servant's." "Oh, I cannot live if she is not better." "Shall I ring for Baptistin?" "No, I will go and speak to him myself." Morel went out, called Baptistin, and whispered a few words to him. The valet ran directly. "Well, have you sent?" asked Monte Cristo, seeing Morel return. "Yes, and now I shall be more calm." "You know I am waiting," said Monte Cristo, smiling. "Yes, and I will tell you. One evening I was in a garden. A clump of trees concealed me. No one suspected I was there. 2 persons passed near me. Allow me to conceal their names for the present. They were speaking in an undertone, and yet I was so interested in what they said that I did not lose a single word." "There is a gloomy introduction, if I may judge from your pallor and shuddering, Morel." "Oh, yes, very gloomy, my friend. Some one had just died in the house to which that garden belonged. One of the persons whose conversation I overheard was the master of the house, the other the physician. The former was confiding to the latter his grief and fear, for it was the second time within a month that death had suddenly and unexpectedly entered that house, which was apparently destined to destruction by some exterminating angel as an object of God's anger." "Ah, indeed," said Monte Cristo, looking earnestly at the young man, and by an imperceptible movement turning his chair so that he remained in the shade, while the light fell full on Maximilian's face. "Yes," continued Morel, "death had entered that house twice within 1 month." "And what did the doctor answer?" asked Monte Cristo. He replied that the death was not a natural one, and must be attributed— "To what?" "To poison." "Indeed," said Monte Cristo with a slight cough, which in moments of extreme emotion helped him to disguise a blush, or his pallor, or the intense interest with which he listened. "Indeed, Maximilian, did you hear that?" "Yes, my dear Count, I heard it, and the doctor added that if another death occurred in a similar way, he must appeal to justice." Monte Cristo listened, or appeared to do so, with the greatest calmness. "Well," said Maximilian, "death came a third time, and neither the master of the house nor the doctor said a word. Death is now, perhaps, striking a fourth blow. Count, what am I bound to do, being in possession of this secret?" "My dear friend," said Monte Cristo, "you appear to be relating an adventure which we all know by heart. I know the house where you heard it, or one very similar to it, a house with a garden, a master, a physician, and where there have been 3 unexpected and sudden deaths. Well, I have not intercepted your confidence, and yet I know all that as well as you, and I have no conscientious scruples. No, it does not concern me. You say an exterminating angel appears to have devoted that house to God's anger. Well, who says your supposition is not reality? Do not notice things which those whose interest it is to see them pass over. If it is God's justice, instead of his anger, which is walking through that house, Maximilian, turn away your face, and let his justice accomplish its purpose." Morel shuddered. There was something mournful, solemn, and terrible in the Count's manner. "Besides," continued he, in so changed a tone that no one would have supposed it was the same person speaking, "besides, who says that it will begin again?" "It has returned, Count," exclaimed Morel. "That is why I hasten to you." "Well, what do you wish me to do? Do you wish me, for instance, to give information to the procureur?" Monte Cristo uttered the last words with so much meaning that Morel started up, cried out, You know of whom I speak, Count, do you not? Perfectly well, my good friend, and I will prove it to you by putting the dots to the I, or rather by naming the persons. You were walking one evening in Monsieur de Villefort's garden. From what you relate, I suppose it to have been the evening of Madame de Saint-Méran's death. You heard Monsieur de Villefort talking to Monsieur d'Avrigny about the death of Monsieur de Saint-Méran, and that no less surprising of the Countess. Monsieur d'Avrigny said he believed they both proceeded from poison, and you, honest man, have ever since been asking your heart and sounding your conscience to know if you ought to expose or conceal this secret. Why do you torment them? Conscience, what hast thou to do with me? As Sterne said, my dear fellow, let them sleep on, if they are asleep. Let them grow pale in their drowsiness, if they are disposed to do so. And pray do you remain in peace, who have no remorse to disturb you. Deep grief was depicted on Morrel's features. He seized Monte Cristo's hand. "But it is beginning again, I say." "Well," said the Count, astonished at his perseverance, which he could not understand, and looking still more earnestly at Maximilian, "let it begin again. It is like the house of Atrides. God has condemned them, and they must submit to their punishment. They will all disappear like the fabrics children build with cards, and which fall one by one under the breath of their builder, even if there are 200 of them. 3 months since it was Monsieur de Saint-Méran, Madame de Saint-Méran. 2 months since, the other day it was Barrois. Today the old Noirtier, or young Valentine." "You knew it," cried Morrel in such a paroxysm of terror that Monte Cristo started. He whom the falling heavens would have found unmoved. "You knew it, and said nothing." "And what is it to me?" replied Monte Cristo, shrugging his shoulders. "Do I know these people? And must I lose the one to save the other? Faith, no, for between the culprit and the victim I have no choice." "But I," cried Morrel, groaning with sorrow, "I love her." "You love? Whom?" cried Monte Cristo, starting to his feet and seizing the 2 hands which Morrel was raising towards heaven. "I love most fondly, I love madly. I love as a man who would give his life-blood to spare her a tear. I love Valentine de Villefort, who is being murdered at this moment. Do you understand me? I love her, and I ask God and you, how can I save her?" Monte Cristo uttered a cry which those only can conceive who have heard the roar of a wounded lion. "Unhappy man!" cried he, wringing his hands in his turn. "You love Valentine, that daughter of an accursed race!" Never had Morrel witnessed such an expression. Never had so terrible an eye flashed before his face. Never had the genius of terror he had so often seen, either on the battlefield or in the murderous nights of Algeria, shaken around him more dreadful fire. He drew back terrified. As for Monte Cristo, after this ebullition, he closed his eyes, as if dazzled by internal light. In a moment he restrained himself so powerfully that the tempestuous heaving of his breast subsided, as turbulent and foaming waves yield to the sun's genial influence when the cloud has passed. This silence, self-control, and struggle lasted about 20 seconds. Then the Count raised his pallid face. "See," said he, "my dear friend, how God punishes the most thoughtless and unfeeling men for their indifference, by presenting dreadful scenes to their view. I, who was looking on, an eager and curious spectator. I, who was watching the working of this mournful tragedy. I, who, like a wicked angel, was laughing at the evil men committed, protected by secrecy. A secret is easily kept by the rich and powerful. I am in my turn bitten by the serpent, whose tortuous course I was watching, and bitten to the heart." Morel groaned. "Come, come," continued the Count. "Complaints are unavailing. Be a man, be strong, be full of hope, for I am here and will watch over you." Morel shook his head sorrowfully. "I tell you to hope. Do you understand me?" cried Monte Cristo. "Remember that I never uttered a falsehood, and am never deceived. It is 12 o'clock, Maximilian. Thank heaven that you came at noon, rather than in the evening or tomorrow morning. Listen, Morel, it is noon. If Valentine is not now dead, she will not die." "How so?" cried Morel. "When I left her dying—" Monte Cristo pressed his hands to his forehead. What was passing in that brain, so loaded with dreadful secrets? What does the angel of light or the angel of darkness say to that mind, at once implacable and generous? God only knows. Monte Cristo raised his head once more, and this time he was calm as a child awaking from its sleep. "Maximilian," said he, "return home. I command you not to stir. Attempt nothing, not to let your countenance betray a thought, and I will send you tidings. Go." "O Count, you overwhelm me with that coolness. Have you, then, power against death? Are you superhuman? Are you an angel?" And the young man, who had never shrunk from danger, shrank before Monte Cristo with indescribable terror. But Monte Cristo looked at him with so melancholy and sweet a smile that Maximilian felt the tears filling his eyes. "I can do much for you, my friend," replied the Count. "Go. I must be alone." Morel, subdued by the extraordinary ascendancy Monte Cristo exercised over everything around him, did not endeavour to resist it. He pressed the Count's hand and left. He stopped one moment at the door for Baptistin, whom he saw in the Rue Matignon, and who was running. Meanwhile, Villefort and d'Avrigny had made all possible haste. Valentine had not revived from her fainting fit on their arrival, and the doctor examined the invalid with all the care the circumstances demanded, and with an interest which the knowledge of the secret intensified twofold. Villefort, closely watching his countenance and his lips, awaited the result of the examination. Noirtier, paler than even the young girl, more eager than Villefort for the decision, was watching also intently and affectionately. At last, d'Avrigny slowly uttered these words: "She is still alive." "Still?" cried Villefort. "Oh, doctor, what a dreadful word is that!" "Yes," said the physician, "I repeat it. She is still alive, and I am astonished at it." "But is she safe?" asked the father. "Yes, since she lives." At that moment d'Avrigny's glance met Noirtier's eye. It glistened with such extraordinary joy, so rich and full of thought, that the physician was struck. He placed the young girl again on the chair. Her lips were scarcely discernible, they were so pale and white, as well as her whole face, and remained motionless, looking at Noirtier, who appeared to anticipate and commend all he did. "Sir," said d'Avrigny to Villefort, "call Mademoiselle Valentine's maid, if you please." Villefort went himself to find her, and d'Avrigny approached Noirtier. "Have you something to tell me?" asked he. The old man winked, his eyes expressively, which we may remember was his only way of expressing his approval. "Privately?" "Yes." "Well, I remain with you." At this moment Villefort returned, followed by the lady's maid, and after her came Madame de Villefort. "What is the matter, then, with this dear child? She has just left me, and she complained of being indisposed, but I do not think seriously of it." The young woman, with tears in her eyes and every mark of affection of a true mother, approached Valentine and took her hand. D'Avrigny continued to look at Noirtier. He saw the eyes of the old man dilate and become round. His cheeks turn pale and tremble. The perspiration stood in drops upon his forehead. "Ah," said he, involuntarily following Noirtier's eyes, which were fixed on Madame de Villefort, who repeated, "This poor child would be better in bed. Come, Fanny, we will put her to bed." Monsieur d'Avrigny, who saw that would be a means of his remaining alone with Noirtier, expressed his opinion that it was the best thing that could be done, but he forbade that anything should be given to her except what he ordered. They carried Valentine away. She had revived, but could scarcely move or speak, so shaken was her frame by the attack. She had, however, just power to give one parting look to her grandfather, who in losing her seemed to be resigning his very soul. D'Avrigny followed the invalid, wrote a prescription, ordered Villefort to take a cabriolet, go in person to a chemist's to get the prescribed medicine, bring it himself, and wait for him in his daughter's room. Then, having renewed his injunction not to give Valentine anything, he went down again to Noirtier, shut the doors carefully, and after convincing himself that no one was listening, "Do you," said he, "know anything of this young lady's illness?" "Yes," said the old man. "We have no time to lose. I will question, and do you answer me?" Noirtier made a sign that he was ready to answer. "Did you anticipate the accident which has happened to your granddaughter?" "Yes." D'Avrigny reflected a moment, then approaching Noirtier, "Pardon what I am going to say," added he, "but no indication should be neglected in this terrible situation. Did you see poor Barrois die?" Noirtier raised his eyes to heaven. "Do you know of what he died?" asked d'Avrigny, placing his hand on Noirtier's shoulder. "Yes," replied the old man. "Do you think he died a natural death?" A sort of smile was discernible on the motionless lips of Noirtier. "Then you have thought that Barrois was poisoned?" "Yes." "Do you think the poison he fell a victim to was intended for him?" "No." "Do you think the same hand which unintentionally struck Barrois has now attacked Valentine?" "Yes." "Then she will die too?" asked d'Avrigny, fixing his penetrating gaze on Noirtier. He watched the effect of this question on the old man. "No," replied he, with an air of triumph which would have puzzled the most clever diviner. "Then you hope?" said d'Avrigny with surprise. "Yes." "What do you hope?" The old man made him understand with his eyes that he could not answer. "Ah, yes, it is true," murmured d'Avrigny. Then turning to Noirtier, "Do you hope the assassin will be tried?" "No." "Then you hope the poison will take no effect on Valentine?" "Yes." "It is no news to you," added d'Avrigny, "to tell you that an attempt has been made to poison her." The old man made a sign that he entertained no doubt upon the subject. "Then how do you hope Valentine will escape?" Noirtier kept his eyes steadfastly fixed on the same spot. D'Avrigny followed the direction and saw that they were fixed on a bottle containing the mixture which he took every morning. "Ah, indeed," said d'Avrigny, struck with a sudden thought. "Has it occurred to you?" Noirtier did not let him finish. "Yes," said he. "To prepare a system to resist poison?" "Yes." "By accustoming her by degrees?" "Yes, yes, yes," said Noirtier, delighted to be understood. "Of course. I had told you that there was brucine in the mixture I gave you." "Yes." "And by accustoming her to that poison, you have endeavoured to neutralize the effect of a similar poison." Noirtier's joy continued. "And you have succeeded!" exclaimed d'Avrigny. "Without that precaution, Valentine would have died before assistance could have been procured. The dose has been excessive, But she has only been shaken by it, and this time, at any rate, Valentine will not die." A superhuman joy expanded the old man's eyes, which were raised towards heaven with an expression of infinite gratitude. At this moment Villefort returned. "Here, doctor," said he, "is what you sent me for." "Was this prepared in your presence?" "Yes," replied the procureur. "Have you not let it get out of your hands?" "No." D'Avrigny took the bottle, poured some drops of the mixture it contained in the hollow of his hand, and swallowed them. "Well," said he, "let us go to Valentine. I will give instructions to everyone, and you, Monsieur de Villefort, will yourself see that no one deviates from them." At the moment when d'Avrigny was returning to Valentine's room, accompanied by Villefort, an Italian priest of serious demeanour and calm and firm tone hired for his use the house adjoining the hotel of Monsieur de Villefort. No one knew how the 3 former tenants of that house left it. About 2 hours afterwards its foundation was reported to be unsafe, but the report did not prevent the new occupant establishing himself there with his modest furniture the same day at 5 o'clock. The lease was drawn up for 3, 6, or 9 years by the new tenant, who, according to the rule of the proprietor, paid 6 months in advance. This new tenant, who, as we have said, was an Italian, was called Il Signor Giacomo Busoni. Workmen were immediately called in, and that same night the passengers at the end of the faubourg saw with surprise that carpenters and masons were occupied in repairing the lower part of the tottering house. End of chapter 94. Chapter 95. Father and Daughter. We saw in a preceding chapter how Madame Danglars went formally to announce to Madame de Villefort the approaching marriage of Eugénie Danglars and Monsieur Andrea Cavalcanti. This announcement, which implied, or appeared to imply, the approval of all the persons concerned in this momentous affair, had been preceded by a scene to which our readers must be admitted. We beg them to take one step backward and to transport themselves, the morning of that day of great catastrophes, into the showy, gilded salon we have before shown them, and which was the pride of its owner, Baron Danglars. In this room, at about 10 o'clock in the morning, the banker himself had been walking to and fro for some minutes, thoughtfully and in evident uneasiness, watching both doors and listening to every sound. When his patience was exhausted, he called his valet. "Etienne," said he, "see why Mademoiselle Eugénie has asked me to meet her in the drawing-room, and why she makes me wait so long." Having given this vent to his ill-humour, the Baron became more calm. Mademoiselle Danglars had that morning requested an interview with her father, and had fixed on the gilded drawing-room as the spot. The singularity of this step, and above all its formality, had not a little surprised the banker, who had immediately obeyed his daughter by repairing first to the drawing-room. Etienne soon returned from his errand. "Mademoiselle's lady's maid says, sir, that Mademoiselle is finishing her toilette and will be here shortly." Danglars nodded, to signify that he was satisfied. To the world and to his servants, Danglars assumed the character of the good-natured man and the indulgent father. This was one of his parts in the popular comedy he was performing, a make-up he had adopted and which suited him about as well as the masks worn on the classic stage by paternal actors, who, seen from one side, were the image of geniality, and from the other showed lips drawn down in chronic ill-temper. Let us hasten to say that in private the genial side descended to the level of the other, so that generally the indulgent man disappeared to give place to the brutal husband and domineering father. "Why the devil does that foolish girl who pretends to wish to speak to me not come into my study? And why on earth does she want to speak to me at all?" He was turning this thought over in his brain for the 20th time, when the door opened and Eugénie appeared, attired in a figured black satin dress, her hair dressed and gloves on as if she were going to the Italian opera. "Well, Eugenie, what is it you want with me? And why in this solemn drawing-room when the study is so comfortable?" "I quite understand why you ask, sir," said Eugenie, making a sign that her father might be seated. "And in fact, your two questions suggest fully the theme of our conversation. I will answer them both, and contrary to the usual method, the last first, because it is the least difficult. I have chosen the drawing-room, sir, as our place of meeting, in order to avoid the disagreeable impressions and influences of a banker's study. Those gilded cash-books, drawers locked like gates of fortresses, heaps of bank bills, come from I know not where, and the quantities of letters from England, Holland, Spain, India, China, and Peru have generally a strange influence on a father's mind, and make him forget that there is in the world an interest greater and more sacred than the good opinion of his correspondents. I have therefore chosen this drawing-room, where you see, smiling and happy in their magnificent frames, your portrait, mine, my mother's, and all sorts of rural landscapes and touching pastorals. I rely much on external impressions. Perhaps with regard to you, they are immaterial, but I should be no artist if I had not some fancies." "Very well," replied Monsieur Danglars, who had listened to all this preamble with imperturbable coolness, but without understanding a word, since, like every man burdened with thoughts of the past, he was occupied with seeking the thread of his own ideas in those of the speaker. "There is, then, the second point cleared up, or nearly so," said Eugenie, without the least confusion, and with that masculine pointedness which distinguished her gesture and her language. "And you appear satisfied with the explanation. Now, let us return to the first. You ask me why I have requested this interview. I will tell you in 2 words. Sir, I will not marry Count Andrea Cavalcanti." Danglars leapt from his chair and raised his eyes and arms towards heaven. "Yes, indeed, sir," continued Eugenie, still quite calm. "You are astonished, I see, for since this little affair began, I have not manifested the slightest opposition, and yet I am always sure, when the opportunity arrives, to oppose a determined and absolute will to people who have not consulted me, and things which displease me. However, this time my tranquillity or passiveness, as philosophers say, proceeded from another source. It proceeded from a wish, like a submissive and devoted daughter." A slight smile was observable on the purple lips of the young girl. "To practice obedience." "Well?" asked Danglars. "Well, sir," replied Eugenie, "I have tried to the very last, and now that the moment has come, I feel, in spite of all my efforts, that it is impossible." "But," said Danglars, whose weak mind was at first quite overwhelmed with the weight of this pitiless logic, marking evident premeditation and force of will, "what is the reason for this refusal, Eugenie? What reason do you assign?" "My reason?" replied the young girl. "Well, it is not that the man is more ugly, more foolish, or more disagreeable than any other. No, Monsieur Andrea Cavalcanti may appear to those who look at men's faces and figures as a very good specimen of his kind. It is not either that my heart is less touched by him than any other. That would be a schoolgirl's reason, which I consider quite beneath me. I actually love no one, sir. You know it, do you not? I do not then see why, without real necessity, I should encumber my life with a perpetual companion. Has not some sage said, 'Nothing too much'? And another, 'I carry all my effects with me.' I have been taught these 2 aphorisms in Latin and in Greek. One is, I believe, from Phaedrus, and the other from Bias. Well, my dear father, in the shipwreck of life, for life is an eternal shipwreck of our hopes, I cast into the sea my useless encumbrance, that is all,
and I remain with my own will disposed to live perfectly alone, and consequently perfectly free."
"Unhappy girl, unhappy girl," murmured Danglars, turning pale, for he knew from long experience the solidity of the obstacle he had so suddenly encountered.
"Unhappy girl?" replied Eugénie. "Unhappy girl, do you say, sir? No, indeed. The exclamation appears quite theatrical and affected. Happy, on the contrary, for what am I in want of? The world calls me beautiful. It is something to be well received. I like a favourable reception. It expands the countenance, and those around me do not then appear so ugly. I possess a share of wit and a certain relative sensibility which enables me to draw from life in general, for the support of mine, all I meet with that is good, like the monkey who cracks the nut to get at its contents. I am rich, for you have one of the first fortunes in France. I am your only daughter, and you are not so exacting as the fathers of the Porte Saint-Martin and Gaiety, who disinherit their daughters for not giving them grandchildren. Besides, the provident law has deprived you of the power to disinherit me, at least entirely, as it has also of the power to compel me to marry Monsieur this or Monsieur that, and so, being beautiful, witty, somewhat talented, as the comic operas say, and rich, and that is happiness, sir, why do you call me unhappy?"
Danglars, seeing his daughter smiling, and proud even to insolence, could not entirely repress his brutal feelings, but they betrayed themselves only by an exclamation. Under the fixed and inquiring gaze levelled at him from under those beautiful black eyebrows, he prudently turned away, and calmed himself immediately, daunted by the power of a resolute mind. "Truly, my daughter," replied he with a smile, "you are all you boast of being, excepting one thing. I will not too hastily tell you which, but would rather leave you to guess it." Eugénie looked at Danglars, much surprised that one flower of her crown of pride, with which she had so superbly decked herself, should be disputed. "My daughter," continued the banker, "you have perfectly explained to me the sentiments which influence a girl like you, who is determined she will not marry. Now it remains for me to tell you the motives of a father like me, who has decided that his daughter shall marry." Eugénie bowed, not as a submissive daughter, but as an adversary prepared for a discussion. "My daughter," continued Danglars, "when a father asks his daughter to choose a husband, he has always some reason for wishing her to marry. Some are affected with the mania of which you spoke just now, that of living again in their grandchildren. This is not my weakness. I tell you at once, family joys have no charm for me. I may acknowledge this to a daughter whom I know to be philosophical enough to understand my indifference, and not to impute it to me as a crime." "This is not to the purpose," said Eugénie. "Let us speak candidly, sir. I admire candour." "Oh," said Danglars, "I can, when circumstances render it desirable, adopt your system, although it may not be my general practice. I will therefore proceed. I have proposed to you to marry, not for your sake, for indeed I do not think of you in the least at the moment. You admire candour, and will now be satisfied, I hope. But because it suited me to marry you as soon as possible, on account of certain commercial speculations I am desirous of entering into." Eugénie became uneasy. "It is just as I tell you, I assure you, and you must not be angry with me, for you have sought this disclosure. I do not willingly enter into arithmetical explanations with an artist like you, who fears to enter my study, lest she should imbibe disagreeable or anti-poetic impressions and sensations. But in that same banker's study, where you were very willingly presented yourself yesterday to ask for the 1,000 francs I give you monthly for pocket money, You must know, my dear young lady, that many things may be learned, useful even to a girl who will not marry. There one may learn, for instance, what, out of regard to your nervous susceptibility, I will inform you of in the drawing-room, namely, that the credit of a banker is his physical and moral life, that credit sustains him as breath animates the body, and Monsieur de Monte Cristo once gave me a lecture on that subject, which I have never forgotten. There we may learn that as credit sinks, the body becomes a corpse, and this is what must happen very soon to the banker who is proud to own so good a logician as you for his daughter. But Eugenie, instead of stooping, drew herself up under the blow. "Ruined?" said she. "Exactly, my daughter. That is precisely what I mean," said Danglars, almost digging his nails into his breast, while he preserved on his harsh features the smile of the heartless, though clever man. "Ruined. Yes, that is it." "Ah," said Eugenie. "Yes, ruined. Now it is revealed, this secret so full of horror, as the tragic poet says. Now, my daughter, learn from my lips how you may alleviate this misfortune, so far as it will affect you." "Oh," cried Eugenie, "you are a bad physiognomist, if you imagine I deplore on my own account the catastrophe of which you warn me. I ruined? And what will that signify to me? Have I not my talent left? Can I not, like Pasta, Malebranche, Grisi, acquire for myself what you would never have given me? Whatever might have been your fortune, 100 or 150,000 livres per annum, for which I shall be indebted to no one but myself, and which, instead of being given as you gave me those poor 12,000 francs, with sour looks and reproaches for my prodigality, will be accompanied with acclamations, with bravos, and with flowers. And if I do not possess that talent, which your smiles prove to me you doubt, should I not still have that ardent love of independence, which will be a substitute for wealth, and which, in my mind, supersedes even the instinct of self-preservation? No, I grieve not on my own account. I shall always find a resource. My books, my pencils, my piano, all the things which cost but little, and which I shall be able to procure, will remain my own. Do you think that I sorrow for Madame Danglars? Undeceive yourself again. Either I am greatly mistaken, or she has provided against the catastrophe which threatens you, and which will pass over without affecting her. She has taken care for herself, at least I hope so, for her attention has not been diverted from her projects by watching over me. She has fostered my independence by professedly indulging my love for liberty. Oh no, sir, from my childhood I have seen too much, and understand too much, of what has passed around me, for misfortune to have an undue power over me. From my earliest recollections, I have been beloved by no one. So much the worse. That has naturally led me to love no one. So much the better. Now you have my profession of faith." "Then," said Danglars, pale with anger, which was not at all due to offended paternal love, "then, mademoiselle, you persist in your determination to accelerate my ruin?" "Your ruin? I accelerate your ruin? What do you mean? I do not understand you." "So much the better. I have a ray of hope left. Listen." "I am all attention," said Eugenie, looking so earnestly at her father that it was an effort for the latter to endure her unrelenting gaze. "Monsieur Cavalcanti," continued Danglars, "is about to marry you, and will place in my hands his fortune, amounting to 3,000,000 livres." "That is admirable," said Eugenie with sovereign contempt, smoothing her gloves out, one upon the other. "You think I shall deprive you of those 3,000,000?" said Danglars. "But do not fear it. They are destined to produce at least 10. I and a brother banker have obtained a grant of a railway. the only industrial enterprise which in these days promises to make good the fabulous prospects that lure once held out to the eternally deluded Parisians in the fantastic Mississippi scheme. As I look at it, a millionth part of a railway is worth fully as much as an acre of waste land on the banks of the Ohio. We make in our case a deposit on a mortgage, which is an advance, as you see, since we gain at least 10, 15, 20 or 100 livres worth of iron in exchange for our money. Well, within a week I am to deposit 4 million for my share. The 4 million, I promise you, will produce 10 or 12.
But during my visit to you the day before yesterday, sir, which you appear to recollect so well, replied Eugenie, I saw you arranging a deposit, is not that the term, of 5 million and a half. You even pointed it out to me in 2 drafts on the treasury, and you were astonished that so valuable a paper did not dazzle my eyes like lightning.
Yes, but those 5 millions and a half are not mine, and are only a proof of the great confidence placed in me. My title of popular banker has gained me the confidence of charitable institutions, and the 5 millions and a half belong to them. At any other time I should not have hesitated to make use of them, but the great losses I have recently sustained are well known, and, as I told you, my credit is rather shaken. That deposit may be at any moment withdrawn, and if I had employed it for another purpose, I should bring on me a disgraceful bankruptcy. I do not despise bankruptcies, believe me, but they must be those which enrich, not those which ruin. Now, if you marry Monsieur Cavalcanti and I get the 3 millions, or even if it is thought I am going to get them, my credit will be restored, and my fortune, which for the last month or 2 has been swallowed up in gulfs which have been opened in my path by an inconceivable fatality, will revive. Do you understand me?
Perfectly. You pledge me for 3 millions, do you not?
The greater the amount, the more flattering it is to you. It gives you an idea of your value.
Thank you. One word more, sir. Do you promise me to make what use you can of the report of the fortune Monsieur Cavalcanti will bring, without touching the money? This is no act of selfishness, but of delicacy. I am willing to help rebuild your fortune, but I will not be an accomplice in the ruin of others.
But since I tell you, cried Danglars, that with these 3 millions—
Do you expect to recover your position, sir, without touching those 3 millions?
I hope so, if the marriage should take place and confirm my credit.
Shall you be able to pay Monsieur Cavalcanti the 500,000 francs you promise for my dowry?
He shall receive them on returning from the mayor's.
Very well.
What next? What more do you want?
I wish to know if, in demanding my signature, you leave me entirely free in my person.
Absolutely.
Then, as I said before, sir, very well. I am ready to marry Monsieur Cavalcanti.
But what are you up to?
Ah, that is my affair. What advantage should I have over you, if, knowing your secret, I were to tell you mine?
Danglars bit his lips. Then, said he, you are ready to pay the official visits, which are absolutely indispensable?
Yes,
replied Eugenie. And to sign the contract in 3 days?
Yes.
Then in my turn I also say, very well. Danglars pressed his daughter's hand in his. But, extraordinary to relate, the father did not say, thank you, my child. Nor did the daughter smile at her father.
Is the conference ended?
asked Eugenie, rising. Danglars motioned that he had nothing more to say. 5 minutes afterwards, the piano resounded to the touch of Mademoiselle d'Armilly's fingers, and Mademoiselle Danglars was singing Brabantio's Malediction on Desdemona. At the end of the piece, Etienne entered, and announced to Eugenie that the horses were in the carriage, and that the Baroness was waiting for her to pay her visits. We have seen them at Villefort. They proceeded then on their course. End of chapter 95. Chapter 96. The Contract. 3 days after the scene we have just described, namely towards 5 o'clock in the afternoon of the day fixed for the signature of the contract between Mademoiselle Eugénie Danglars and Andrea Cavalcanti, whom the banker persisted in calling Prince, a fresh breeze was stirring the leaves in the little garden in front of the Count of Monte Cristo's house, and the Count was preparing to go out. While his horses were impatiently pawing the ground, held in by the coachman who had been seated a quarter of an hour on his box, the elegant phaeton with which we are familiar rapidly turned the angle of the entrance gate and cast out on the doorsteps Monsieur Andrea Cavalcanti, as decked up and gay as if he were going to marry a princess. He inquired after the Count with his usual familiarity, and ascending lightly to the second story, met him at the top of the stairs. The Count stopped on seeing the young man. As for Andrea, he was launched, and when he was once launched, nothing stopped him. "Ah, good morning, my dear Count," said he. "Ah, Monsieur Andrea," said the latter, with his half-jesting tone. "How do you do?" "Charmingly, as you see. I am come to talk to you about 1,000 things, but first tell me, were you going out or just returned?" "I was going out, sir." "Then in order not to hinder you, I would get up with you, if you please, in your carriage, and Tom shall follow with my phaeton in tow." "No," said the Count, with an imperceptible smile of contempt, for he had no wish to be seen in the young man's society. "No, I prefer listening to you here, my dear Monsieur Andrea. We can chat better indoors, and there is no coachman to overhear our conversation." The Count returned to a small drawing-room on the first floor, sat down, and crossing his legs, motioned to the young man to take a seat also. Andrea assumed his gayest manner. "You know, my dear Count," said he, "the ceremony is to take place this evening. At 9 o'clock the contract is to be signed at my father-in-law's." "Ah, indeed," said Monte Cristo. "What? Is it news to you? Has not Monsieur Danglars informed you of the ceremony?" "Ah, yes," said the Count. "I received a letter from him yesterday, but I do not think the hour was mentioned." "Possibly my father-in-law trusted to its general notoriety." "Well," said Monte Cristo, "you are fortunate, Monsieur Cavalcanti. It is a most suitable alliance you are contracting, and Mademoiselle Danglars is a handsome girl." "Yes, indeed she is," replied Cavalcanti in a very modest tone. "Above all, she is very rich, at least I believe so," said Monte Cristo. "Very rich, do you think?" replied the young man. "Doubtless. It is said Monsieur Danglars conceals at least half of his fortune." "And he acknowledges 15 or 20 millions," said Andrea with a look sparkling with joy. "Without reckoning," added Monte Cristo, "that he is on the eve of entering into a sort of speculation already in vogue in the United States and in England, but quite novel in France." "Yes, yes, I know what you mean. The railway of which he has obtained the grant, is it not?" "Precisely. It is generally believed he will gain 10 millions by that affair." 10 millions? Do you think so? It is magnificent," said Cavalcanti, who was quite confounded at the metallic sound of these golden words. "Without reckoning," replied Monte Cristo, "that all his fortune will come to you, and justly too, since Mademoiselle Danglars is an only daughter. Besides, your own fortune, as your father assured me, is almost equal to that of your betrothed. But enough of money matters. Do you know, Monsieur Andrea, I think you have managed this affair rather skilfully." "Not badly, by any means," said the young man. "I was born for a diplomatist." "Well, you must become a diplomatist. Diplomacy, you know, is something that is not to be acquired. It is instinctive. Have you lost your heart?" "Indeed, I fear it. replied Andrea, in the tone in which he had heard Durante or Valere reply to Alceste at the Théâtre Français. "Is your love returned?" "I suppose so," said Andrea with a triumphant smile, "since I am accepted. But I must not forget one grand point." "Which?" "That I have been singularly assisted." "Nonsense." "I have indeed." "By circumstances?" "No, by you." "By me? Not at all, Prince," said Monte Cristo, laying a marked stress on the title. "What have I done for you? Are not your name, your social position, and your merit sufficient?" "No," said Andrea. "No, it is useless for you to say so, Count. I maintain that the position of a man like you has done more than my name, my social position, and my merit." "You are completely mistaken, sir," said Monte Cristo coldly, who felt the perfidious manoeuvre of the young man, and understood the bearing of his words. "You only acquired my protection after the influence and fortune of your father had been ascertained. For, after all, who procured for me, who had never seen either you or your illustrious father, the pleasure of your acquaintance? Two of my good friends, Lord Wilmore and the Abbé Busoni. What encouraged me not to become your surety, but to patronize you? Your father's name, so well known in Italy and so highly honoured. Personally, I do not know you." This calm tone and perfect ease made Andrea feel that he was, for the moment, restrained by a more muscular hand than his own, and that the restraint could not be easily broken through. "Oh, then my father has a really very large fortune, Count." "It appears so, sir," replied Monte Cristo. "Do you know if the marriage settlement he promised me has come?" "I have been advised of it." "But the 3 millions?" "The 3 millions are probably on the road." "Then I shall really have them." "Oh, well," said the Count, "I do not think you have yet known the want of money." Andrea was so surprised that he pondered the matter for a moment, then arousing from his reverie, "Now, sir, I have one request to make to you, which you will understand, even if it should be disagreeable to you." "Proceed," said Monte Cristo. "I have formed an acquaintance, thanks to my good fortune, with many noted persons, and have, at least for the moment, a crowd of friends. But marrying, as I am about to do before all Paris, I ought to be supported by an illustrious name, and in the absence of the paternal hand some powerful one ought to lead me to the altar. Now my father is not coming to Paris, is he? He is old, covered with wounds, and suffers dreadfully, he says, in travelling." "Indeed?" "Well, I am come to ask a favour of you." "Of me?" "Yes, of you." "And pray what may it be?" "Well, to take his part." "Ah, my dear sir! What, after the varied relations I have had the happiness to sustain towards you, can it be that you know me so little as to ask such a thing? Ask me to lend you 500,000, and, although such a loan is somewhat rare, on my honour you should annoy me less. Know then what I thought I had already told you, that in participation in this world's affairs, more especially in their moral aspects, the Count of Monte Cristo has never ceased to entertain the scruples and even the superstitions of the East. I, who have a seraglio at Cairo, one at Smyrna, and one at Constantinople, preside at a wedding? Never." "Then you refuse me?" "Decidedly. And were you my son or my brother, I would refuse you in the same way." "But what must be done?" said Andrea, disappointed. "You said just now that you had 100 friends." "Very true, but you introduced me at Monsieur Danglars." "Not at all. Let us recall the exact facts. You met him at a dinner party at my house, and you introduced yourself at his house. That is a totally different affair." "Yes, but by my marriage you have forwarded that."
I? Not in the least. I beg you to believe. Recollect what I told you when you asked me to propose you. Oh, I never make matches, my dear prince. It is my settled principle. Andrea bit his lips. But at least you will be there. Will all Paris be there? Oh, certainly. Well, like all Paris, I shall be there too, said the Count. And will you sign the contract? I see no objection to that. My scruples do not go thus far. Well, since you will grant me no more, I must be content with what you give me. But one word more, Count. What is it? Advice. Be careful. Advice is worse than a service. Oh, you can give me this without compromising yourself. Tell me what it is. Is my wife's fortune 500,000 livres? That is the sum Monsieur Danglars himself announced. Must I receive it or leave it in the hands of the notary? This is the way such affairs are generally arranged when it is wished to do them stylishly. Your two solicitors appoint a meeting. When the contract is signed, for the next or the following day, then they exchange the two portions, for which they each give a receipt. Then, when the marriage is celebrated, they place the amount at your disposal as the chief member of the alliance. Because, said Andrea with a certain ill-concealed uneasiness, I thought I heard my father-in-law say that he intended embarking our property in that famous railway affair of which you spoke just now. Well, replied Monte Cristo, it will be the way everybody says of trebling your fortune in 12 months. Baron Danglars is a good father, and knows how to calculate. In that case, said Andrea, everything is all right excepting your refusal, which quite grieves me. You must attribute it only to natural scruples under similar circumstances. Well, said Andrea, let it be as you wish. This evening, then, at 9 o'clock. Adieu till then. Notwithstanding a slight resistance on the part of Monte Cristo, whose lips turned pale, but who preserved his ceremonious smile, Andrea seized the Count's hand, pressed it, jumped into his phaeton, and disappeared. The 4 or 5 remaining hours before 9 o'clock arrived, Andrea employed in riding, paying visits, designed to induce those of whom he had spoken to appear at the banker's in their gayest equipage, dazzling them by promises of shares in schemes which have since turned every brain, and in which Danglars was just taking the initiative. In fact, at 8:30 in the evening, the grand salon, the gallery adjoining, and the 3 other drawing-rooms on the same floor were filled with a perfumed crowd, who sympathized but little in the event, but who all participated in that love of being present wherever there is anything fresh to be seen. An academician would say that the entertainments of the fashionable world are collections of flowers which attract inconstant butterflies, famished bees, and buzzing drones. No one could deny that the rooms were splendidly illuminated. The light streamed forth on the gilt mouldings and the silk hangings, and all the bad taste of decorations which had only their richness to boast of shone in its splendour. Mademoiselle Eugénie was dressed with elegant simplicity in a figured white silk dress, and a white rose half concealed in her jet-black hair was her only ornament, unaccompanied by a single jewel. Her eyes, however, betrayed that perfect confidence which contradicted the girlish simplicity of this modest attire. Madame Danglars was chatting at a short distance with Debray, Beauchamp, and Château Renaud. Debray was admitted to the house for this grand ceremony, but on the same plane with everyone else, and without any particular privilege. Monsieur Danglars, surrounded by deputies and men connected with the revenue, was explaining a new theory of taxation which he intended to adopt when the course of events had compelled the government to call him into the ministry. Andrea, on whose arm hung one of the most consummate dandies of the opera,
was explaining to him rather cleverly, since he was obliged to be bold to appear at ease, his future projects, and the new luxuries he meant to introduce to Parisian fashions with his 175,000 livres per annum. The crowd moved to and fro in the rooms like an ebb and flow of turquoises, rubies, emeralds, opals, and diamonds. As usual, the oldest women were the most decorated, and the ugliest the most conspicuous. If there was a beautiful lily or a sweet rose, you had to search for it, concealed in some corner behind a mother with a turban, or an aunt with a bird of paradise. At each moment, in the midst of the crowd, the buzzing and the laughter, the doorkeeper's voice was heard announcing some name well known in the financial department, respected in the army or illustrious in the literary world, and which was acknowledged by a slight movement in the different groups. But for one whose privilege it was to agitate that ocean of human waves, how many were received with a look of indifference or a sneer of disdain. At the moment when the hand of the massive timepiece, representing Endymion asleep, pointed to 9 on its golden face, and the hammer, the faithful type of mechanical thought, struck 9 times, the name of the Count of Monte Cristo resounded in its turn, and as if by an electric shock, all the assembly turned towards the door. The Count was dressed in black, and with his habitual simplicity, his white waistcoat displayed his expansive, noble chest, and his black stock was singularly noticeable because of its contrast with the deadly paleness of his face. His only jewellery was a chain, so fine that the slender gold thread was scarcely perceptible on his white waistcoat. A circle was immediately formed around the door. The Count perceived at one glance Madame Danglars at one end of the drawing-room, Monsieur Danglars at the other, and Eugénie in front of him. He first advanced towards the Baroness, who was chatting with Madame de Villefort, who had come alone, Valentine being still an invalid, and without turning aside, so clear was the road left for him, he passed from the Baroness to Eugénie, whom he complimented in such rapid and measured terms that the proud artist was quite struck. Near her was Mademoiselle Louise d'Armilly, who thanked the Count for the letters of introduction he had so kindly given her for Italy, which she intended immediately to make use of. On leaving these ladies, he found himself with Danglars, who had advanced to meet him. Having accomplished these 3 social duties, Monte Cristo stopped, looking around him with that expression peculiar to a certain class, which seems to say, "I have done my duty, now let others do theirs." Andrea, who was in an adjoining room, had shared in the sensation caused by the arrival of Monte Cristo, and now came forward to pay his respects to the Count. He found him completely surrounded. All were eager to speak to him, as is always the case with those whose words are few and weighty. The solicitors arrived at this moment, and arranged their scrawled papers on the velvet cloth embroidered with gold which covered the table prepared for the signature. It was a gilt table, supported on lion's claws. One of the notaries sat down, the other remained standing. They were about to proceed to the reading of the contract, which half Paris assembled was to sign. All took their places, or rather the ladies formed a circle, while the gentlemen, more indifferent to the restraints of what Boileau calls the energetic style, commented on the feverish agitation of Andrea, on Monsieur Danglars' riveted attention, Eugénie's composure, and the light and sprightly manner in which the Baroness treated this important affair. The contract was read during a profound silence, but as soon as it was finished, the buzz was redoubled through all the drawing-rooms. The brilliant sums, the rolling millions which were to be at the command of the 2 young people, and which crowned the display of the wedding presents and the young lady's diamonds, which had been made in a room entirely appropriated for that purpose, had exercised to the full their delusions over the envious assembly. Mademoiselle Danglars' charms were heightened in the opinion of the young men, and for the moment seemed to outvie the sun in splendour. As for the ladies, it is needless to say that while they coveted the millions, they thought they did not need them for themselves. as they were beautiful enough without them. Andrea, surrounded by his friends, complimented, flattered, beginning to believe in the reality of his dream, was almost bewildered. The notary solemnly took the pen, flourished it above his head, and said, "Gentlemen, we are about to sign the contract." The Baron was to sign first, then the representative of Monsieur Cavalcanti senior, then the Baroness, afterwards the future couple, as they are styled in the abominable phraseology of legal documents. The Baron took the pen and signed, then the representative. The Baroness approached, leaning on Madame de Villefort's arm. "My dear," said she, as she took the pen, "is it not vexatious? An unexpected incident in the affair of murder and theft at the Count of Monte Cristo's, in which he nearly fell a victim, deprives us of the pleasure of seeing Monsieur de Villefort." "Indeed," said Monsieur Danglars, in the same tone in which he would have said, "Oh, well, what do I care?" "As a matter of fact," said Monte Cristo, approaching, "I am much afraid that I am the involuntary cause of his absence." "What, you, Count?" said Madame Danglars, signing. "If you are, take care, for I shall never forgive you." Andrea pricked up his ears. "But it is not my fault, as I shall endeavour to prove." Everyone listened eagerly. Monte Cristo, who so rarely opened his lips, was about to speak. "You remember," said the Count, during the most profound silence, "that the unhappy wretch who came to rob me died at my house. The supposition is that he was stabbed by his accomplice on attempting to leave it." "Yes," said Danglars. "In order that his wounds might be examined, he was undressed, and his clothes were thrown into a corner, where the police picked them up, with the exception of the waistcoat, which they overlooked." Andrea turned pale, and drew towards the door. He saw a cloud rising in the horizon, which appeared to forebode a coming storm. "Well, this waistcoat was discovered today, covered with blood and with a hole over the heart." The lady screamed, and 2 or 3 prepared to faint. "It was brought to me. No one could guess what the dirty rag could be. I alone suspected that it was the waistcoat of the murdered man. My valet, in examining this mournful relic, felt a paper in the pocket and drew it out. It was a letter addressed to you, Baron." "To me?" cried Danglars. "Yes, indeed, to you. I succeeded in deciphering your name under the blood with which the letter was stained," replied Monte Cristo, amid the general outburst of amazement. "But," asked Madame Danglars, looking at her husband with uneasiness, "how could that prevent Monsieur de Villefort?" "In this simple way, madame," replied Monte Cristo. "The waistcoat and the letter were both what is termed circumstantial evidence. I therefore sent them to the king's attorney. You understand, my dear Baron, that legal methods are the safest in criminal cases. It was, perhaps, some plot against you." Andrea looked steadily at Monte Cristo, and disappeared in the second drawing-room. "Possibly," said Danglars. "Was not this murdered man an old galley slave?" "Yes," replied the Count, "a felon named Caderousse." Danglars turned slightly pale. Andrea reached the ante-room beyond the little drawing-room. "But go on signing," said Monte Cristo. "I perceive that my story has caused a general emotion, and I beg to apologize to you, Baroness, and to Mademoiselle Danglars." The Baroness, who had signed, returned the pen to the notary. "Prince Cavalcanti," said the latter. "Prince Cavalcanti, where are you?" "Andrea, Andrea," repeated several young people who were already on sufficiently intimate terms with him to call him by his Christian name. "Call the prince. Inform him that it is his turn to sign," cried Danglars to one of the floor-keepers. But at the same instant the crowd of guests rushed in alarm into the principal salon, as if some frightful monster had entered the apartments, Quaerums quem deveret. There was indeed reason to retreat, to be alarmed, and to scream. An officer was placing 2 soldiers at the door of each drawing-room, and was advancing towards Danglars, preceded by a commissary of police, girded with his scarf. Madame Danglars uttered a scream and fainted. Danglars, who thought himself threatened, certain consciences are never calm, Danglars, even before his guests, showed a countenance of abject terror. "What is the matter, sir?" asked Monte Cristo, advancing to meet the commissioner. "Which of you gentlemen," asked the magistrate, without replying to the count, "answers to the name of Andrea Cavalcanti?" A cry of astonishment was heard from all parts of the room. They searched, they questioned. "But who then is Andrea Cavalcanti?" asked Danglars in amazement. "A galley slave, escaped from confinement at Toulon." "And what crime has he committed?" "He is accused," said the commissary with his inflexible voice, "of having assassinated the man named Caderousse, his former companion in prison, at the moment he was making his escape from the house of the Count of Monte Cristo." Monte Cristo cast a rapid glance around him. Andrea was gone. End of chapter 96. Chapter 97. The Departure for Belgium. A few minutes after the scene of confusion produced in the salons of Monsieur Danglars by the unexpected appearance of the brigade of soldiers, and by the disclosure which had followed, the mansion was deserted with as much rapidity as if a case of plague or of cholera morbus had broken out among the guests. In a few minutes, through all the doors, down all the staircases, by every exit, everyone hastened to retire, or rather to fly, for it was a situation where the ordinary condolences, which even the best friends are so eager to offer in great catastrophes, were seen to be utterly futile. There remained in the banker's house only Danglars, closeted in his study and making his statement to the officer of gendarmes, Madame Danglars, terrified, in the boudoir with which we are acquainted, and Eugénie, who with a haughty air and disdainful lip had retired to her room with her inseparable companion, Mademoiselle Louise d'Armilly. As for the numerous servants, more numerous that evening than usual, for their number was augmented by cooks and butlers from the Café de Paris, venting on their employers their anger at what they termed the insult to which they had been subjected, they collected in groups in the hall, in the kitchens, or in their rooms, thinking very little of their duty, which was thus naturally interrupted. Of all this household, only 2 persons deserve our notice. These are Mademoiselle Eugénie Danglars and Mademoiselle Louise d'Armilly. The betrothed had retired, as we said, with haughty air, disdainful lip, and the demeanour of an outraged queen, followed by her companion, who was paler and more disturbed than herself. On reaching her room, Eugénie locked her door, while Louise fell on a chair. "Ah, what a dreadful thing!" said the young musician. "Who would have suspected it? Monsieur Andrea Cavalcanti, a murderer, a galley slave escaped, a convict!" An ironical smile curled the lip of Eugénie. "In truth, I was fated," said she. "I escaped the Morcerf only to fall into the Cavalcanti." "Oh, do not confound the two, Eugénie. Hold your tongue. The men are all infamous, and I am happy to be able now to do more than detest them. I despise them." "What shall we do?" asked Louise. "What shall we do?" "Yes." "Why, the same we had intended doing 3 days since. Set off." "What? Although you are not now going to be married, you intend still—" "Listen, Louise. I hate this life of the fashionable world, always ordered, measured, ruled like our music paper. What I have always wished for, desired and coveted, is the life of an artist, free and independent, relying only on my own resources and accountable only to myself. Remain here? What for? That they may try a month hence to marry me again? And to whom? Monsieur Debray, perhaps, as it was once proposed.
No, Louise, no. This evening's adventure will serve for my excuse. I did not seek one. I did not ask for one. God sends me this, and I hail it joyfully." "How strong and courageous you are," said the fair, frail girl to her brunette companion. "Do you not know me? Come, Louise, let us talk of our affairs. The post-chaise was happily brought 3 days since." "Have you had it sent where we are to go for it?" "Yes." "Our passport?" "Here it is." And Eugénie, with her usual precision, opened a printed paper and read: "Monsieur Léon d'Armilly, 20 years of age, profession artist, hair black, eyes black, travelling with his sister." "Capital! How did you get this passport?" "When I went to ask Monsieur de Monte Cristo for letters to the directors of the theatres at Rome and Naples, I expressed my fears of travelling as a woman. He perfectly understood them, and undertook to procure for me a man's passport, and 2 days after I received this, to which I had added with my own hand, travelling with his sister." "Well," said Eugénie cheerfully, "we have then only to pack our trunks. We shall start the evening of the signing of the contract, instead of the evening of the wedding. That is all." "But consider the matter seriously, Eugénie." "Oh, I am done with considering. I am tired of hearing only of market reports, of the end of the month, of the rise and fall of Spanish funds, of Haitian bonds. Instead of that, Louise, do you understand? Air, liberty, melody of birds, plains of Lombardy, Venetian canals, Roman palaces, the Bay of Naples. How much have we, Louise?" The young girl to whom this question was addressed drew from an inlaid secretary a small portfolio with a lock, in which she counted 23 banknotes. 23,000 francs, said she. "And as much at least in pearls, diamonds, and jewels," said Eugénie. "We are rich. With 45,000 francs we can live like princesses for 2 years, and comfortably for 4. But before 6 months, you with your music, and I with my voice, we shall double our capital. Come, you shall take charge of the money, I of the jewel box, so that if one of us has the misfortune to lose her treasure, the other will still have hers left. Now, the portmanteau. Let us make haste. The portmanteau." "Stop," said Louise, going to listen at Madame Danglars' door. "What do you fear?" "That we may be discovered." "The door is locked." "They may tell us to open it." "They may if they like, but we will not." "You are a perfect Amazon, Eugénie." And the 2 young girls began to heap into a trunk all the things they thought they should require. "There now," said Eugénie. "While I change my costume, do you lock the portmanteau." Louise pressed with all the strength of her little hands on the top of the portmanteau. "But I cannot," said she. "I am not strong enough. Do you shut it?" "Ah, you do well to ask," said Eugénie, laughing. "I forgot that I was Hercule, and you only the pale Omphale." And the young girl, kneeling on the top, pressed the 2 parts of the portmanteau together, and Mademoiselle d'Armilly passed the bolt of the padlock through. When this was done, Eugénie opened a drawer of which she kept the key, and took from it a wadded violet silk travelling cloak. "Here," said she, "you see I have thought of everything. With this cloak you will not be cold." "But you?" "Oh, I am never cold, you know. Besides, with these men's clothes—" "Will you dress here?" "Certainly." "Shall you have time?" "Do not be uneasy, you little coward. All our servants are busy, discussing the grand affair. Besides, what is there astonishing when you think of the grief I ought to be in, that I shut myself up? Tell me." "No, truly, you comfort me." "Come and help me." From the same drawer she took a man's complete costume, from the boots to the coat, and a provision of linen, where there was nothing superfluous but every requisite. Then, with a promptitude which indicated that this was not the first time she had amused herself by adopting the garb of the opposite sex, Eugénie drew on the boots and pantaloons, tied her cravat, buttoned her waistcoat up to the throat, and put on a coat which admirably fitted her beautiful figure. "Oh, that is very good indeed, it is very good," said Louise, looking at her with admiration. "But that beautiful black hair, those magnificent braids, which made all the ladies sigh with envy, will they go under a man's hat like the one I see down there?" "You shall see," said Eugenie, and with her left hand seizing the thick mass, which her long fingers could scarcely grasp, she took in her right hand a pair of long scissors, and soon the steel met through the rich and splendid hair, which fell in a cluster at her feet as she leaned back to keep it from her coat. Then she grasped the front hair, which she also cut off, without expressing the least regret. On the contrary, her eyes sparkled with greater pleasure than usual under her ebony eyebrows. "Oh, the magnificent hair!" said Louise with regret. "And am I not 100 times better thus?" cried Eugenie, smoothing the scattered curls of her hair, which had now quite a masculine appearance. "And do you not think me handsomer so?" "Oh, you are beautiful, always beautiful," cried Louise. "Now, where are you going?" "To Brussels. If you like, it is the nearest frontier. We can go to Brussels, Liège, Aix-la-Chapelle, then up the Rhine to Strasbourg. We will cross Switzerland and go down into Italy by the Saint-Gothard. Will that do?" "Yes." "What are you looking at?" "I am looking at you. Indeed, you are adorable like that. One would say you were carrying me off." "And they would be right, pardieu." "Oh, I think you swore, Eugenie." And the two young girls, whom every one might have thought plunged in grief, the one on her own account, the other from interest in her friend, burst out laughing as they cleared away every visible trace of the disorder which had naturally accompanied the preparations for their escape. Then, having blown out the lights, the two fugitives, looking and listening eagerly with outstretched necks, opened the door of a dressing-room which led by a side staircase down to the yard, Eugenie going first, and holding with one arm the portmanteau, which by the opposite handle Mademoiselle d'Armilly scarcely raised with both hands. The yard was empty. The clock was striking 12. The porter was not yet gone to bed. Eugenie approached softly, and saw the old man sleeping soundly in an armchair in his lodge. She returned to Louise, took up the portmanteau, which she had placed for a moment on the ground, and they reached the archway under the shadow of the wall. Eugenie concealed Louise in an angle of the gateway, so that if the porter chanced to awake, he might see but one person. Then, placing herself in the full light of the lamp which lit the yard, "Gate!" cried she with her finest contralto voice, and rapping at the window. The porter got up as Eugenie expected, and even advanced some steps to recognize the person who was going out. But seeing a young man striking his boot impatiently with his riding-whip, he opened it immediately. Louise slid through the half-open gate like a snake, and bounded lightly forward. Eugenie, apparently calm, although in all probability her heart beat somewhat faster than usual, went out in her turn. A porter was passing, and they gave him the portmanteau. Then the two young girls, having told him to take it to number 36 Rue de la Victoire, walked behind this man, whose presence comforted Louise. As for Eugenie, she was as strong as a Judith or a Delilah. They arrived at the appointed spot. Eugenie ordered the porter to put down the portmanteau, gave him some pieces of money, and, having rapped at the shutter, sent him away. The shutter where Eugenie had rapped was that of a little laundress, who had been previously warned and was not yet gone to bed. She opened the door. "Mademoiselle," said Eugenie, "let the porter get the post-chaise from the coach-house, and fetch some post-horses from the hotel. Here are 5 francs for his trouble." "Indeed," said Louise, "I admire you, and I could almost say respect you." The laundress looked on in astonishment, but as she had been promised 20 louis, she made no remark. In a quarter of an hour the porter returned with a post-boy and horses, which were harnessed and put in the post-chaise in a minute, while the porter fastened the portmanteau on with the assistance of a cord and a strap. "Here is the passport," said the postilion. "Which way are we going, young gentlemen?" "To Fontainebleau,"
replied Eugenie with an almost masculine voice.
"What do you say?" asked Louise. "I am giving them the slip," said Eugenie. "This woman to whom we have given 20 louis may betray us for 40. We will soon alter our direction."
And the young girl jumped into the britska, which was admirably arranged for sleeping in, without scarcely touching the step.
"You are always right,"
said the music teacher, seating herself by the side of her friend. A quarter of an hour afterwards, the postilion, having been put in the right road, passed with a crack of his whip through the gateway of the Barrière Saint-Martin.
"Ah,"
said Louise, breathing freely.
"Here we are out of Paris."
"Yes, my dear, the abduction is an accomplished fact," replied Eugenie.
"Yes, and without violence," said Louise.
"I shall bring that forward as an extenuating circumstance," replied Eugenie. These words were lost in the noise which the carriage made in rolling over the pavement of La Villette. Monsieur Danglars no longer had a daughter. End of chapter 97. Chapter 98. The Bell and Bottle Tavern. And now, let us leave Mademoiselle Danglars and her friend pursuing their way to Brussels, and return to poor Andrea Cavalcanti, so inopportunely interrupted in his rise to fortune. Notwithstanding his youth, Master Andrea was a very skilful and intelligent boy. We have seen that on the first rumour which reached the salon, he had gradually approached the door, and, crossing 2 or 3 rooms, at last disappeared. But we have forgotten to mention one circumstance, which nevertheless ought not to be omitted. In one of the rooms he crossed, the trousseau of the bride-elect was on exhibition. There were caskets of diamonds, cashmere shawls, Valenciennes lace, English veilings, and in fact all the tempting things, the bare mention of which makes the hearts of young girls bound with joy, and which is called the corbeille. Now, in passing through this room, Andrea proved himself not only to be clever and intelligent, but also provident, for he helped himself to the most valuable of the ornaments before him. Furnished with this plunder, Andrea leapt with a lighter heart from the window, intending to slip through the hands of the gendarme. Tall and well-proportioned as an ancient gladiator, and muscular as a Spartan, he walked for a quarter of an hour without knowing where to direct his steps, actuated by the sole idea of getting away from the spot where, if he lingered, he knew that he would surely be taken. Having passed through the Rue Mont Blanc, guided by the instinct which leads thieves always to take the safest path, he found himself at the end of the Rue Lafayette. There he stopped, breathless and panting. He was quite alone. On one side was the vast wilderness of the Saint-Lazare. On the other, Paris enshrouded in darkness. "Am I to be captured?" he cried. "No, not if I can use more activity than my enemies. My safety is now a mere question of speed." At this moment he saw a cab at the top of the Faubourg Poissonnière. The dull driver, smoking his pipe, was plodding along towards the limits of the Faubourg Saint-Denis, where no doubt he ordinarily had his station. "Ho, friend!" said Benedetto. "What do you want, sir?" asked the driver. "Is your horse tired?" "Tired? Oh, yes, tired enough. He has done nothing the whole of his blessed day. 4 wretched fares and 20 sous over, making in all 7 francs, are all that I have earned, and I ought to take 10 to the owner." "Will you add these 20 francs to the 7 you have?" "With pleasure, sir. 20 francs are not to be despised. Tell me what I am to do for this." "A very easy thing, if your horse isn't tired." "I tell you, he'll go like the wind. Only tell me which way to drive." "Towards the Louvre." "I know the way. You get good sweetened rum over there." "Exactly so. I merely wish to overtake one of my friends with whom I am going to hunt tomorrow at Chapelle-en-Savel. He should have waited for me here with a cabriolet till 11:30. It is 12, and tired of waiting, he must have gone on." "It is likely." "Well, will you try and overtake him?" Nothing I should like better.
If you do not overtake him before you reach Bourget, you shall have 20 francs. If not before Louvre, 30.
And if we do overtake him?
40, said Andrea after a moment's hesitation, at the end of which he remembered that he might safely promise.
That's all right, said the man. Hop in and we're off. Hoopla!
Andrea got into the cab, which passed rapidly through the Faubourg Saint-Denis, along the Faubourg Saint-Martin, crossed the barrier, and threaded its way through the interminable Villette. They never overtook the chimerical friend, yet Andrea frequently inquired of people on foot whom he passed, and at the inns which were not yet closed, for a green cabriolet and bay horse, and as there are a great many cabriolets to be seen on the road to the Low Countries, and as 9/10 of them are green, the inquiries increased at every step. Every one had just seen it pass. It was only 500, 200, 100 steps in advance. At length they reached it, but it was not the friend. Once the cab was also passed by a calash, rapidly whirled along by 2 post-horses. "Ah," said Cavalcanti to himself, "if I only had that britska, those 2 good post-horses, and above all the passport that carries them on." And he sighed deeply. The calash contained Mademoiselle Danglars and Mademoiselle d'Armilly. "Hurry, hurry," said Andrea. "We must overtake him soon." And the poor horse resumed the desperate gallop it had kept up since leaving the barrier, and arrived steaming at Louvre. "Certainly," said Andrea. "I shall not overtake my friend, but I shall kill your horse. Therefore I had better stop. Here are 30 francs. I will sleep at the Red Horse, and will secure a place in the first coach. Good night, friend." And Andrea, after placing 6 pieces of 5 francs each in the man's hand, leapt lightly onto the pathway. The cabman joyfully pocketed the sum, and turned back on his road to Paris. Andrea pretended to go towards the Red Horse Inn, but after leaning an instant against the door, and hearing the last sound of the cab, which was disappearing from view, he went on his road, and with a lusty stride soon traversed the space of 2 leagues. Then he rested. He must be near Chapelle-en-Serval, where he pretended to be going. It was not fatigue that stayed Andrea there. It was that he might form some resolution, adopt some plan. It would be impossible to make use of a diligence, equally so to engage post-horses. To travel either way a passport was necessary. It was still more impossible to remain in the department of the Oise, one of the most open and strictly guarded in France. This was quite out of the question, especially to a man like Andrea, perfectly conversant with criminal matters. He sat down by the side of the moat, buried his face in his hands, and reflected. 10 minutes after he raised his head, his resolution was made. He threw some dust over the top-coat, which he had found time to unhook from the antechamber, and button over his ball costume, and going to Chapelle-en-Serval, he knocked loudly at the door of the only inn in the place. The host opened. "My friend," said Andrea, "I was coming from Montfontaine to Senlis, when my horse, which is a troublesome creature, stumbled and threw me. I must reach Compiègne tonight, or I shall cause deep anxiety to my family. Could you let me hire a horse of you?" An innkeeper has always a horse to let, whether it be good or bad. The host called the stable-boy and ordered him to saddle Whitey. Then he awoke his son, a child of 7 years, whom he ordered to ride before the gentleman and bring back the horse. Andrea gave the innkeeper 20 francs, and in taking them from his pocket dropped a visiting card. This belonged to one of his friends at the Café de Paris, so that the innkeeper, picking it up after Andrea had left, was convinced that he had let his horse to the Count of Mauléon, 25 Rue Saint-Dominique, that being the name and address on the card. Whitey was not a fast animal, but he kept up an easy, steady pace. In 3 hours and a half, Andrea had traversed the 9 leagues which separated him from Compiègne, and 4 o'clock struck as he reached the place where the coaches stop. There's an excellent tavern at Compiègne, well remembered by those who have ever been there.
Andrea, who had often stayed there in his rides about Paris, recollected the Bell and Bottle Inn. He turned around, saw the sign by the light of a reflected lamp, and having dismissed the child, giving him all the small coin he had about him, he began knocking at the door, very reasonably concluding that, having now 3 or 4 hours before him, he had best fortify himself against the fatigues of the morrow by a sound sleep and a good supper. A waiter opened the door. "My friend," said Andrea, "I have been dining at Saint-Jean-au-Bois, and expected to catch the coach which passes by at midnight. But, like a fool, I have lost my way, and have been walking for the last 4 hours in the forest. Show me into one of those pretty little rooms which overlook the court, and bring me a cold fowl and a bottle of Bordeaux." The waiter had no suspicions. Andrea spoke with perfect composure. He had a cigar in his mouth, and his hands in the pocket of his top-coat. His clothes were fashionably made, his chin smooth, his boots irreproachable. He looked merely as if he had stayed out very late, that was all. While the waiter was preparing his room, the hostess arose. Andrea assumed his most charming smile, and asked if he could have number 3, which he had occupied on his last stay at Compiègne. Unfortunately, number 3 was engaged by a young man who was travelling with his sister. Andrea appeared in despair, but consoled himself when the hostess assured him that number 7, prepared for him, was situated precisely the same as number 3. And while warming his feet and chatting about the last races at Chantilly, he waited until they announced his room to be ready. Andrea had not spoken without cause of the pretty rooms looking out upon the court of the Bell Tavern, which, with its triple galleries like those of a theatre, with the jessamine and clematis twining round the light columns, forms one of the prettiest entrances to an inn that you can imagine. The fowl was tender, the wine old, the fire clear and sparkling, and Andrea was surprised to find himself eating with as good an appetite as though nothing had happened. Then he went to bed, and almost immediately fell into that deep sleep which is sure to visit men of 20 years of age, even when they are torn with remorse. Now, here we are obliged to own that Andrea ought to have felt remorse, but that he did not. This was the plan which had appealed to him to afford the best chance of his security. Before daybreak he would awake, leave the inn after rigorously paying his bill, and reaching the forest he would, under pretence of making studies in painting, test the hospitality of some peasants, procure himself the dress of a woodcutter and a hatchet, casting off the lion-skin to assume that of the woodman. Then, with his hands covered with dirt, his hair darkened by means of a leaden comb, his complexion embrowned with a preparation for which one of his old comrades had given him the recipe, he intended, by following the wooded districts, to reach the nearest frontier, walking by night and sleeping in the day in the forests and quarries, and only entering inhabited regions to buy a loaf from time to time. Once past the frontier, Andrea proposed making money of his diamonds, and by uniting the proceeds to 10 banknotes he always carried about with him in case of accident, he would then find himself possessor of about 50,000 livres, which he philosophically considered as no very deplorable condition after all. Moreover, he reckoned much on the interest of the Danglars to hush up the rumour of their own misadventures. These were the reasons which, added to the fatigue, caused Andrea to sleep so soundly. In order that he might awaken early, he did not close the shutters, but contented himself with bolting the door and placing on the table an unclasped and long-pointed knife, whose temper he well knew, and which was never absent from him. About 7 in the morning, Andrea was awakened by a ray of sunlight, which played warm and brilliant upon his face. In all well-organized brains the predominating idea, and there always is one, is sure to be the last thought before sleeping, and the first upon waking in the morning. Andrea had scarcely opened his eyes when his predominating idea presented itself, and whispered in his ear that he had slept too long. He jumped out of bed and ran to the window. A gendarme was crossing the court. A gendarme is one of the most striking objects in the world, even to a man void of uneasiness. but for one who has a timid conscience, and with good cause too, the yellow, blue and white uniform is really very alarming.
"Why is that gendarme here?" asked Andrea of himself.
Then all at once he replied with that logic which the reader has doubtless remarked in him.
"There is nothing astonishing in seeing a gendarme at an inn. Instead of being astonished, let me dress myself."
And the youth dressed himself with a facility his valet de chambre had failed to rob him of during the 2 months of fashionable life he had led in Paris.
"Now then,"
said Andrea, while dressing himself,
"I'll wait till he leaves, and then I'll slip away."
And saying this, Andrea, who had now put on his boots and cravat, stole gently to the window, and a second time lifted up the muslin curtain. Not only was the first gendarme still there, but the young man now perceived a second yellow, blue and white uniform at the foot of the staircase, the only one by which he could descend, while a third, on horseback, holding a musket in his fist, was posted as a sentinel at the great street door which alone afforded the means of egress. The appearance of the third gendarme settled the matter, for a crowd of curious loungers was extended before him, effectually blocking the entrance to the hotel.
"They're after me,"
was Andrea's first thought.
"The devil!"
A pallor overspread the young man's forehead, and he looked around him with anxiety. His room, like all those on the same floor, had but one outlet to the gallery in the sight of everybody.
"I am lost,"
was his second thought, and indeed, for a man in Andrea's situation, an arrest meant the assizes, trial, and death. Death without mercy or delay. For a moment he convulsively pressed his head within his hands, and during that brief period he became nearly mad with terror. But soon a ray of hope glimmered in the multitude of thoughts which bewildered his mind, and a faint smile played upon his white lips and pallid cheeks. He looked around and saw the objects of his search upon the chimney-piece. They were a pen, ink, and paper. With forced composure he dipped the pen in the ink and wrote the following lines upon a sheet of paper. "I have no money to pay my bill, but I am not a dishonest man. I leave behind me as a pledge this pin worth 10 times the amount. I shall be excused for leaving at daybreak, for I was ashamed." He then drew the pin from his cravat and placed it on the paper. This done, instead of leaving the door fastened, he drew back the bolts and even placed the door ajar, as though he had left the room, forgetting to close it, and slipping into the chimney, like a man accustomed to that kind of gymnastic exercise, having effaced the marks of his feet upon the floor, he commenced climbing the only opening which afforded him the means of escape. At this precise time the first gendarme Andrea had noticed walked upstairs, preceded by the commissary of police, and supported by the second gendarme, who guarded the staircase, and was himself reinforced by the one stationed at the door. Andrea was indebted for this visit to the following circumstances. At daybreak the telegraphs were set at work in all directions, and almost immediately the authorities in every district had exerted their utmost endeavours to arrest the murderer of Caderousse. Compiègne, that royal residence and fortified town, is well furnished with authorities, gendarmes, and commissaries of police. They therefore began operations as soon as the telegraphic dispatch arrived, and the Bell and Bottle being the best-known hotel in the town, they had naturally directed their first inquiries there. Now, besides the reports of the sentinels guarding the Hôtel de Ville, which is next door to the Bell and Bottle, it had been stated by others that a number of travellers had arrived during the night. The sentinel, who was relieved at 6 o'clock in the morning, remembered perfectly that just as he was taking his post, a few minutes past 4, a young man arrived on horseback, with a little boy before him. The young man, having dismissed the boy and horse, knocked at the door of the hotel, which was opened, and again closed after his entrance. This late arrival had attracted much suspicion, and the young man being no other than Andrea, the commissary and gendarme, who was a brigadier, directed their steps towards his room. They found the door ajar. "Oh, no," said the brigadier, who thoroughly understood the trick. "A bad sign to find the door open. I would rather find it triply bolted." And indeed, the little note and pin upon the table confirmed or rather corroborated the sad truth. Andrea had fled. We say corroborated because the brigadier was too experienced to be convinced by a single proof. He glanced around, looked in the bed, shook the curtains, opened the closets, and finally stopped at the chimney. Andrea had taken the precaution to leave no traces of his feet in the ashes, but it still was an outlet, and in this light was not to be passed over without serious investigation. The brigadier sent for some sticks and straw, and having filled the chimney with them, set a light to it. The fire crackled, and the smoke ascended like the dull vapour from a volcano. But still no prisoner fell down, as they expected. The fact was that Andrea at war with society ever since his youth was quite as deep as a gendarme, even though we were advanced to the rank of brigadier, and quite prepared for the fire. He'd climbed out on the roof and was crouching down against the chimney-pots. At one time he thought he was saved, for he heard the brigadier exclaim in a loud voice to the two gendarmes, "He is not here!" But venturing to peep, he perceived that the latter, instead of retiring, as might have been reasonably expected upon this announcement, were watching with increased attention. It was now his turn to look about him. The Hôtel de Ville, a massive 16th-century building, was on his right. Anyone could descend from the openings in the tower and examine every corner of the roof below, and Andrea expected momentarily to see the head of a gendarme appear at one of these openings. If once discovered, he knew he would be lost, for the roof afforded no chance of escape. He therefore resolved to descend, not through the same chimney by which he had come up, but by a similar one conducting to another room. He looked around for a chimney from which no smoke issued, and having reached it, he disappeared through the orifice without being seen by anyone. At the same minute, one of the little windows of the Hôtel de Ville was thrown open, and the head of a gendarme appeared. For an instant it remained motionless as one of the stone decorations of the building. Then, after a long sigh of disappointment, the head disappeared. The brigadier, calm and dignified as the law he represented, passed through the crowd, without answering the 1,000 questions addressed to him, and re-entered the hotel. "Well?" asked the two gendarmes. "Well, my boys," said the brigadier, "the brigand must really have escaped early this morning. But we will send to the Villers-Cotterêts and Noyon roads and search the forest, when we shall catch him, no doubt." The honourable functionary had scarcely expressed himself thus, in that intonation which is peculiar to brigadiers of the gendarmerie, when a loud scream, accompanied by the violent ringing of a bell, resounded through the court of the hotel. "Ah, what is that?" cried the brigadier. "Some traveller seems impatient," said the host. "What number was it that rang?" "Number 3. Run, waiter." At this moment the screams and ringing were redoubled. "Ah," said the brigadier, stopping the servant. "The person who is ringing appears to want something more than a waiter. We will attend upon him with a gendarme. Who occupies numéro 3? "The little fellow who arrived last night in a post-chaise with his sister, and who asked for an apartment with 2 beds. The bell here rang for the 3rd time, with another shriek of anguish. "Follow me, Monsieur Commissary," said the brigadier. "Tread in my steps." "Wait an instant," said the host. "Numéro 3 has 2 staircases, inside and outside." "Good," said the brigadier. "I will take charge of the inside one. Are the carbines loaded?" "Yes, brigadier." "Well, you guard the exterior, and if he attempts to fly, fire upon him. He must be a great criminal from what the telegraph says." The brigadier, followed by the commissary, disappeared by the inside staircase, accompanied by the noise which his assertions respecting Andrea had excited in the crowd. This is what had happened. Andrea had very cleverly managed to descend 2/3 of the chimney, but then his foot slipped, and notwithstanding his endeavours, he came into the room with more speed and noise than he intended. It would have signified little had the room been empty, but unfortunately it was occupied. 2 ladies, sleeping in one bed, were awakened by the noise, and fixing their eyes upon the spot whence the sound proceeded, they saw a man. One of these ladies, the fair one, uttered those terrible shrieks which resounded through the house, while the other, rushing to the bell-rope, rang with all her strength. Andrea, as we can see, was surrounded by misfortune. "For pity's sake," he cried, pale and bewildered, without seeing whom he was addressing, "for pity's sake, do not call assistance. Save me. I will not harm you." "Andrea, the murderer!" cried one of the ladies. "Eugenie! Mademoiselle Danglars!" exclaimed Andrea, stupefied. "Help! Help!" cried Mademoiselle d'Armilly, taking the bell from her companion's hand and ringing it yet more violently. "Save me! I am pursued!" said Andrea, clasping his hands. "For pity, for mercy's sake, do not deliver me up!" "It is too late. They are coming," said Eugenie. "Well, conceal me somewhere. You can say you were needlessly alarmed. You can turn their suspicions and save my life." The 2 ladies, pressing closely to one another, and drawing the bedclothes tightly around them, remained silent to this supplicating voice, repugnance and fear taking possession of their minds. "Well, be it so," at length said Eugenie. "Return by the same road you came, and we will say nothing about you, unhappy wretch."
Here he is!" cried a voice from the landing. "Here he is! I see him!"
The brigadier had put his eye to the keyhole and had discovered Andrea in a posture of entreaty. A violent blow from the butt-end of the musket burst open the lock. 2 more forced out the bolts, and the broken door fell in. Andrea ran to the other door, leading to the gallery, ready to rush out. But he was stopped short, and he stood with his body a little thrown back, pale and with the useless knife in his clinched hand. "Fly, then!" cried Mademoiselle d'Armilly, whose pity returned as her fears diminished. "Fly!" "Or kill yourself," said Eugenie, in a tone which a vestal in the amphitheatre would have used when urging the victorious gladiator to finish his vanquished adversary. Andrea shuddered, and looked on the young girl with an expression which proved how little he understood such ferocious honour. "Kill myself?" he cried, throwing down his knife. "Why should I do so?" "Why, you said," answered Mademoiselle Danglars, "that you would be condemned to die like the worst criminals." "Bah!" said Cavalcanti, crossing his arms. "One has friends." The brigadier advanced to him, sword in hand. "Come, come," said Andrea. "Sheath your sword, my fine fellow. There is no occasion to make such a fuss, since I give myself up." And he held out his hands to be manacled. The girls looked with horror upon this shameful metamorphosis, the man of the world shaking off his covering and appearing as a galley slave. Andrea turned towards them, and with an impertinent smile asked, "Have you any message for your father, Mademoiselle Danglars? For in all probability I shall return to Paris." Eugenie covered her face with her hands. "Oh-ho," said Andrea. "You need not be ashamed, even though you did post after me. Was I not nearly your husband?" And with this raillery, Andrea went out, leaving the 2 girls a prey to their own feelings of shame and to the comments of the crowd. An hour after, they stepped into their calash, both dressed in feminine attire. The gate of the hotel had been closed to screen them from sight, but they were forced, when the door was open, to pass through a throng of curious glances and whispering voices. Eugenie closed her eyes, but though she could not see, she could hear, and the sneers of the crowd reached her in the carriage. "Oh, why is not the world a wilderness?" she exclaimed, throwing herself into the arms of Mademoiselle d'Armilly, her eyes sparkling with the same kind of rage which made Nero wish that the Roman world had but one neck, that he might sever it at a single blow. The next day they stopped at the Hôtel de Flandre at Brussels. The same evening Andrea was incarcerated in the conciergerie. End of chapter 98. Chapter 99. The Law. We have seen how quietly Mademoiselle Danglars and Mademoiselle d'Armilly accomplished their transformation and flight, the fact being that everyone was too much occupied in his or her own affairs to think of theirs. We will leave the banker contemplating the enormous magnitude of his debt before the phantom of bankruptcy, and follow the Baroness, who, after being momentarily crushed under the weight of the blow which had struck her, had gone to seek her usual adviser, Lucien Debray. The Baroness had looked forward to this marriage as a means of ridding her of a guardianship which, over a girl of Eugenie's character, could not fail to be rather a troublesome undertaking, for in the tacit relations which maintained the bond of family union, the mother, to maintain her ascendancy over her daughter, must never fail to be a model of wisdom and a type of perfection. Now, Madame Danglars feared Eugenie's sagacity and the influence of Mademoiselle d'Armilly. She had frequently observed the contemptuous expression with which her daughter looked upon Debray, an expression which seemed to imply that she understood all her mother's amorous and pecuniary relationships with the intimate secretary. Moreover, she saw that Eugenie detested Debray, not only because he was a source of dissension and scandal under the paternal roof, but because she had once classed him in that catalogue of bipeds whom Plato endeavours to withdraw from the appellation of men, and whom Diogenes designated as animals upon 2 legs without feathers. Unfortunately, in this world of ours, each person views things through a certain medium, and so is prevented from seeing in the same light as others, and Madame Danglars therefore very much regretted that the marriage of Eugenie had not taken place, not only because the match was good and likely to ensure the happiness of her child, but because it would also set her at liberty. She ran therefore to Debray, who, after having, like the rest of Paris, witnessed the contract scene and the scandal attending it, had retired in haste to his club, where he was chatting with some friends upon the events which served as a subject of conversation for 3/4 of that city known as the capital of the world. At the precise time when Madame Danglars, dressed in black and concealed in a long veil, was ascending the stairs leading to Debray's apartments, notwithstanding the assurances of the concierge that the young man was not at home, Debray was occupied in repelling the insinuations of a friend, who tried to persuade him that after the terrible scene which had just taken place, he ought, as a friend of the family, to marry Mademoiselle Danglars and her 2 millions. Debray did not defend himself very warmly, for the idea had sometimes crossed his mind. Still, when he recollected the independent, proud spirit of Eugenie, he positively rejected it as utterly impossible, though the same thought again continually recurred and found a resting place in his heart. Tea, play, and the conversation, which had become interesting during the discussion of such serious affairs, lasted till 1 o'clock in the morning. Meanwhile, Madame Danglars, veiled and uneasy, awaited the return of Debray in the little green room, seated between 2 baskets of flowers, which she had that morning sent, and which, it must be confessed, Debray had himself arranged and watered with so much care that his absence was half excused in the eyes of the poor woman. At 20 minutes of 12, Madame Danglars, tired of waiting, returned home. Women of a certain grade are like prosperous grisettes in one respect. They seldom return home after 12 o'clock. The Baroness returned to the hotel with as much caution as Eugenie used in leaving it. She ran lightly upstairs, and with an aching heart entered her apartment, contiguous, as we know, to that of Eugenie. She was fearful of exciting any remark, and believed firmly in her daughter's innocence and fidelity to the paternal roof. She listened at Eugenie's door, and hearing no sound, tried to enter. But the bolts were in place. Madame Danglars then concluded that the young girl had been overcome with the terrible excitement of the evening, and had gone to bed and to sleep. She called the maid and questioned her.
"Mademoiselle Eugenie," said the maid, "retired to her apartment with Mademoiselle d'Armilly. They then took tea together, after which they desired me to leave, saying that they needed me no longer."
Since then the maid had been below, and, like everyone else, she thought the young ladies were in their own room. Madame Danglars, therefore, went to bed without a shadow of suspicion, and began to muse over the recent events. In proportion as her memory became clearer, the occurrences of the evening were revealed in their true light. What she had taken for confusion was a tumult. What she had regarded as something distressing was in reality a disgrace. And then the Baroness remembered that she had felt no pity for poor Mercédès, who had been afflicted with as severe a blow through her husband and son.
"Eugénie," she said to herself, "is lost, and so are we. The affair, as it will be reported, will cover us with shame, for in a society such as ours, satire inflicts a painful and incurable wound. How unfortunate that Eugénie is possessed of that strange character which so often made me tremble."
And her glance was turned towards heaven, where a mysterious providence disposes all things, and out of a fault, nay, even a vice, sometimes produces a blessing. And then her thoughts, cleaving through space like a bird in the air, rested on Cavalcanti. This Andrea was a wretch, a robber, an assassin, and yet his manners showed the effects of a sort of education, if not a complete one. He had been presented to the world with the appearance of an immense fortune, supported by an honourable name. How could she extricate herself from this labyrinth? To whom would she apply to help her out of this painful situation? Debray, to whom she had run, with the first instinct of a woman, towards the man she loves, and who yet betrays her. Debray could but give her advice. She must apply to someone more powerful than he. The Baroness then thought of Monsieur de Villefort. It was Monsieur de Villefort who had remorselessly brought misfortune into her family, as though they had been strangers. But no. On reflection, the procureur was not a merciless man, and it was not the magistrate, slave to his duties, but the friend, the loyal friend, who roughly but firmly cut into the very core of the corruption. It was not the executioner, but the surgeon who wished to withdraw the honour of Danglars from ignominious association with the disgraced young man they had presented to the world as their son-in-law. And since Villefort, the friend of Danglars, had acted in this way, no one could suppose that he had been previously acquainted with or had lent himself to any of Andrea's intrigues. Villefort's conduct, therefore, upon reflection, appeared to the Baroness as if shaped for their mutual advantage. But the inflexibility of the procureur should stop there. She would see him the next day, and if she could not make him fail in his duties as a magistrate, she would at least obtain all the indulgence he could allow. She would invoke the past, recall old recollections. She would supplicate him by the remembrance of guilty yet happy days. Monsieur de Villefort would stifle the affair. He had only to turn his eyes on one side and allow Andrea to fly, and follow up the crime under that shadow of guilt called contempt of court. And after this reasoning, she slept easily. At 9 o'clock next morning she arose, and without ringing for her maid or giving the least sign of her activity, she dressed herself in the same simple style as on the previous night. Then running downstairs, she left the hotel, walked to the Rue de Provence, called a cab, and drove to Monsieur de Villefort's house. For the last month, this wretched house had presented the gloomy appearance of a lazaretto infected with the plague. Some of the apartments were closed within and without. The shutters were only opened to admit a minute's air, showing the scared face of a footman, and immediately afterwards the window would be closed, like a gravestone falling on a sepulchre, and the neighbours would say to each other in a low voice, "Will there be another funeral today at the procureur's house?" Madame Danglars involuntarily shuddered at the desolate aspect of the mansion. Descending from the cab, she approached the door with trembling knees and rang the bell. 3 times did the bell ring with a dull, heavy sound seeming to participate in the general sadness, before the concierge appeared and peeped through the door, which he opened just wide enough to allow his words to be heard. He saw a lady, a fashionable, elegantly dressed lady, and yet the door remained almost closed.
"Do you intend opening the door?" said the Baroness.
"First, madame, who are you?"
"Who am I? You know me well enough."
"We no longer know anyone, madame."
"You must be mad, my friend," said the Baroness.
"Where do you come from?"
"Oh, this is too much."
"Madame, these are my orders. Excuse me, your name?"
"The Baroness Danglars. You have seen me 20 times."
"Possibly, madame. And now, what do you want?"
"Oh, how extraordinary! I shall complain to Monsieur de Villefort of the impertinence of his servants."
"Madame, this is precaution, not impertinence. No one enters here without an order from Monsieur d'Avrigny, or without speaking to the procureur."
"Well, I have business with the procureur."
"Is it pressing business?"
"You can imagine so, since I have not even brought my carriage out yet. But enough of this. Here is my card. Take it to your master."
"Madame will await my return?"
"Yes, go."
The concierge closed the door, leaving Madame Danglars in the street. She had not long to wait. Directly afterwards the door was opened wide enough to admit her, and when she had passed through, it was again shut. Without losing sight of her for an instant, the concierge took a whistle from his pocket as soon as they entered the court, and blew it. The valet de chambre appeared on the doorsteps.
"You will excuse this poor fellow, madame," he said as he preceded the Baroness. "But his orders are precise, and Monsieur de Villefort begged me to tell you that he could not act otherwise."
In the court, showing his merchandise, was a tradesman who had been admitted with the same precautions. The Baroness ascended the steps. She felt herself strongly infected with the sadness which seemed to magnify her own, and still guided by the valet de chambre, who never lost sight of her for an instant, she was introduced to the magistrate's study. Preoccupied as Madame Danglars had been with the object of her visit, the treatment she had received from these underlings appeared to her so insulting that she began by complaining of it. But Villefort, raising his head, bowed down by grief, looked up at her with so sad a smile that her complaints died upon her lips. "Forgive my servants," he said. "For a terror I cannot blame them for. From being suspected they had become suspicious." Madame Danglars had often heard of the terror to which the magistrate alluded, but without the evidence of her own eyesight she could never have believed that the sentiment had been carried so far.
"You too, then, are unhappy?" she said.
"Yes, madame," replied the magistrate.
"Then you pity me?"
"Sincerely, madame."
"And you understand what brings me here?"
"You wish to speak to me about the circumstance which has just happened?"
"Yes, sir. A fearful misfortune."
"You mean a mischance?"
"A mischance?"
repeated the Baroness.
"Alas, madame,"
said the procureur with his imperturbable calmness of manner,
"I consider those alone misfortunes which are irreparable."
"And do you suppose this will be forgotten?"
"Everything will be forgotten, madame," said Villefort. "Your daughter will be married tomorrow, if not today. In a week, if not tomorrow, and I do not think you can regret the intended husband of your daughter."
Madame Danglars gazed on Villefort, stupefied to find him so almost insultingly calm.
"Am I come to a friend?"
she asked in a tone full of mournful dignity.
"You know that you are, madame,"
said Villefort, whose pale cheeks became slightly flushed as he gave her the assurance. And truly this assurance carried him back to different events from those now occupying the Baroness and him.
"Well, then, be more affectionate, my dear Villefort," said the Baroness. "Speak to me not as a magistrate, but as a friend, and when I am in bitter anguish of spirit, do not tell me that I ought to be gay."
Villefort bowed.
"When I hear misfortune named, madame," he said, "I have within the last few months contracted the bad habit of thinking of my own, and then I cannot help drawing up an egotistical parallel in my mind. That is the reason that by the side of my misfortunes, yours appear to me mere mischances. That is why my dreadful position makes yours appear enviable. But this annoys you. Let us change the subject. You were saying, madame."
"I came to ask you, my friend," said the Baroness, "what will be done with this impostor?"
"Impostor?" repeated Villefort. "Certainly, madame. You appear to extenuate some cases and exaggerate others. Impostor, indeed! Monsieur Andrea Cavalcanti, or rather Monsieur Benedetto, is nothing more nor less than an assassin."
"Sir, I do not deny the justice of your correction, but the more severely you arm yourself against that unfortunate man, the more deeply will you strike our family. Come, forget him for a moment, and instead of pursuing him, let him go."
"You are too late, madame. The orders are issued."
"Well, should he be arrested, do they think they will arrest him?"
"I hope so."
"If they should arrest him, I know that sometimes prisoners afford means of escape. Will you leave him in prison?"
The procureur shook his head.
"At least keep him there till my daughter be married."
"Impossible, madame. Justice has its formalities."
"What, even for me?"
said the Baroness, half jesting, half in earnest. "For all, even for myself among the rest," replied Villefort.
"Ah!"
exclaimed the Baroness, without expressing the ideas which the exclamation betrayed. Villefort looked at her with that piercing glance which reads the secrets of the heart. "Yes, I know what you mean," he said. "You refer to the terrible rumours spread abroad in the world that the deaths which have kept me in mourning for the last 3 months, and from which Valentine has only escaped by a miracle, have not happened by natural means."
"I was not thinking of that," replied Madame Danglars quickly.
"Yes, you were thinking of it, and with justice. You could not help thinking of it and saying to yourself, 'You who pursue crime so vindictively, answer now, why are there unpunished crimes in your dwelling?'" The Baroness became pale. "You were saying this, were you not?"
"Well, I own it."
"I will answer you." Villefort drew his armchair nearer to Madame Danglars. Then, resting both hands upon his desk, he said, in a voice more hollow than usual, "There are crimes which remain unpunished, because the criminals are unknown, and we might strike the innocent instead of the guilty. But when the culprits are discovered—" Villefort here extended his hand toward a large crucifix placed opposite to his desk. "When they are discovered, I swear to you by all I hold most sacred, that whoever they may be, they shall die. Now, after the oath I have just taken, and which I will keep, madame, dare you ask for mercy for that wretch?"
"But, sir, are you sure he is guilty as they say?"
"Listen, this is his description. Benedetto, condemned at the age of 16 for 5 years to the galleys for forgery. He promised well, as you see. First a runaway, then an assassin."
"And who is this wretch?"
"Who can tell? A vagabond, a Corsican."
"Has no one owned him?"
"No one. His parents are unknown."
"But who was the man who brought him from Lucca?"
"Another rascal like himself. Perhaps his accomplice."
The Baroness clasped her hands. "Villefort!" she exclaimed in her softest and most captivating manner.
"For heaven's sake, madame," said Villefort, with a firmness of expression not altogether free from harshness, "for heaven's sake, do not ask pardon for me, for a guilty wretch. What am I? The law. Has the law any eyes to witness your grief? Has the law ears to be melted by your sweet voice? Has the law a memory for all those soft recollections you endeavour to recall? No, madame. The law has commanded, and when it commands, it strikes. You will tell me that I am a living being and not a code, a man and not a volume. Look at me. Madame, look around me. Have mankind treated me as a brother? Have they loved me? Have they spared me? Has anyone shown the mercy towards me that you now ask at my hands? No, madame. They struck me, always struck me. Woman, siren that you are, do you persist in fixing on me that fascinating eye which reminds me that I ought to blush? Well, be it so. Let me blush for the faults you know, and perhaps for even more than those. But having sinned myself, it may be more deeply than others. I never rest till I have torn the disguises from my fellow creatures and found out their weaknesses. I have always found them, and more, I repeat it with joy, with triumph. I have always found some proof of human perversity or error. Every criminal I condemn seems to me living evidence that I am not a hideous exception to the rest. Alas, 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 all the world is wicked. Let us therefore strike at wickedness. Villefort pronounced these last words with a feverish rage which gave a ferocious eloquence to his words.
"But," said Madame Danglars, resolving to make a last effort, "this young man, though a murderer, is an orphan, abandoned by everybody."
"So much the worse, or rather so much the better. It has been so ordained that he may have none to weep his fate."
"But this is trampling on the weak, sir."
"The weakness of a murderer."
"His dishonour reflects upon us."
"Is not death in my house?"
"Oh, sir," exclaimed the Baroness, "you are without pity for others. Well, then, I tell you they will have no mercy on you."
"Be it so," said Villefort, raising his arms to heaven.
"At least, delay the trial till the next assizes. We shall then have 6 months before us."
"No, madame," said Villefort. "Instructions have been given. There are yet 5 days left. 5 days are more than I require. Do you not think that I also long for forgetfulness? While working night and day, I sometimes lose all recollection of the past, and then I experience the same sort of happiness I can imagine the dead feel. Still, it is better than suffering."
"But, sir, he has fled. Let him escape. Inaction is a pardonable offence."
"I tell you it is too late. Early this morning the telegraph was employed, and at this very minute—" "Sir," said the valet de chambre, entering the room, "a dragoon has brought his dispatch from the Minister of the Interior."
Villefort seized the letter and hastily broke the seal.
Madame Danglars trembled with fear. Villefort started with joy. "Arrested!" he exclaimed. "He was taken at Compiègne, and all is over."
Madame Danglars rose from her seat, pale and cold. "Adieu, sir," she said.
"Adieu, madame," replied the king's attorney, as in an almost joyful manner he conducted her to the door. Then, turning to his desk, he said, striking the letter with the back of his right hand, "Come, I had a forgery, 3 robberies, and 2 cases of arson. I only wanted a murder, and here it is. It will be a splendid session."
End of chapter 99.
Chapter 100. The Apparition. As the procureur had told Madame Danglars, Valentine was not yet recovered. Bowed down with fatigue, she was indeed confined to her bed, and it was in her own room and from the lips of Madame de Villefort that she heard all the strange events we have related. We mean the flight of Eugénie and the arrest of Andrea Cavalcanti, or rather Benedetto, together with the accusation of murder pronounced against him. But Valentine was so weak that this recital scarcely produced the same effect it would have done had she been in her usual state of health. Indeed, her brain was only the seat of vague ideas and confused forms, mingled with strange fancies, alone presented themselves before her eyes. During the daytime, Valentine's perceptions remained tolerably clear, owing to the constant presence of Monsieur Noirtier, who caused himself to be carried to his granddaughter's room,
and watched her with his paternal tenderness. Villefort also, on his return from the law courts, frequently passed an hour or two with his father and child. At 6 o'clock, Villefort retired to his study. At 8, Monsieur d'Avrigny himself arrived, bringing the night draught prepared for the young girl, and then Monsieur Noirtier was carried away. A nurse of the doctor's choice succeeded them, and never left till about 10 or 11 o'clock, when Valentine was asleep. As she went downstairs, she gave the keys of Valentine's room to Monsieur de Villefort, so that no one could reach the sick room excepting through that of Madame de Villefort and little Edward. Every morning Morel called on Noirtier to receive news of Valentine, and, extraordinary as it seemed, each day found him less uneasy. Certainly, though Valentine still laboured under dreadful nervous excitement, she was better, and, moreover, Monte Cristo had told him when, half distracted, he had rushed to the Count's house, that if she were not dead in 2 hours, she would be saved. Now 4 days had elapsed, and Valentine still lived. The nervous excitement of which we speak pursued Valentine even in her sleep, or rather in that state of somnolence which succeeded her waking hours. It was then, in the silence of night, in the dim light shed from the alabaster lamp on the chimney-piece, that she saw the shadows pass and repass which hover over the bed of sickness, and fan the fever with their trembling wings. First, she fancied she saw her stepmother threatening her. Then Morel stretched his arms towards her. Sometimes mere strangers like the Count of Monte Cristo came to visit her. Even the very furniture, in these moments of delirium, seemed to move. And this state lasted till about 3 o'clock in the morning, when a deep, heavy slumber overcame the young girl, from which she did not awake till daylight. On the evening of the day on which Valentine had learned of the flight of Eugénie and the arrest of Benedetto, Villefort having retired as well as Noirtier and d'Avrigny, her thoughts wandered in a confused maze, alternately reviewing her own situation and the events she had just heard. 11 o'clock had struck. The nurse, having placed the beverage prepared by the doctor within reach of the patient, and locked the door, was listening with terror to the comments of the servants in the kitchen, and storing her memory with all the horrible stories which had for some months past amused the occupants of the antechambers in the house of the king's attorney. Meanwhile an unexpected scene was passing in the room which had been so carefully locked. 10 minutes had elapsed since the nurse had left. Valentine, who for the last hour had been suffering from the fever which returned nightly, incapable of controlling her ideas, was forced to yield to the excitement which exhausted itself in producing and reproducing a succession and recurrence of the same fancies and images. The night-lamp threw out countless rays, each resolving itself into some strange form to her disordered imagination, when suddenly, by its flickering light, Valentine thought she saw the door of her library, which was in the recess by the chimney-piece, open slowly, though she in vain listened for the sound of the hinges on which it turned. At any other time, Valentine would have seized the silken bell-pull and summoned assistance. But nothing astonished her in her present situation. Her reason told her that all the visions she beheld were but the children of her imagination, and the conviction was strengthened by the fact that in the morning no traces remained of the nocturnal phantoms, who disappeared with the coming of daylight. From behind the door a human figure appeared, but the girl was too familiar with such apparitions to be alarmed, and therefore only stared, hoping to recognize Morel. The figure advanced toward the bed, and appeared to listen with profound attention. At this moment a ray of light glanced across the face of the midnight visitor. "It is not he," she murmured, and waited, in the assurance that this was but a dream, for the man to disappear or assume some other form. Still, she felt her pulse, and finding it throb violently, she remembered that the best method of dispelling such illusions was to drink, for a draught of the beverage prepared by the doctor to allay her fever seemed to cause a reaction of the brain, and for a short time she suffered less. Valentine therefore reached her hand towards the glass, but as soon as her trembling arm left the bed, the apparition advanced more quickly towards her, and approached the young girl so closely that she fancied she heard his breath and felt the pressure of his hand. This time the illusion, or rather the reality, surpassed anything Valentine had before experienced. She began to believe herself really alive and awake, and the belief that her reason was this time not deceived made her shudder. The pressure she felt was evidently intended to arrest her arm, and she slowly withdrew it. Then the figure, from whom she could not detach her eyes, and who appeared more protecting than menacing, took the glass and, walking towards the night-light, held it up as if to test its transparency. This did not seem sufficient. The man, or rather the ghost, for he trod so softly that no sound was heard, then poured out about a spoonful into the glass and drank it. Valentine witnessed this scene with a sentiment of stupefaction. Every minute she had expected that it would vanish and give place to another vision. But the man, instead of dissolving like a shadow, again approached her and said in an agitated voice, "Now you may drink." Valentine shuddered. It was the first time one of these visions had ever addressed her in a living voice, and she was about to utter an exclamation. The man placed his finger on her lips. "The Count of Monte Cristo," she murmured. It was easy to see that no doubt now remained in the young girl's mind as to the reality of the scene. Her eyes started with terror, her hands trembled, and she rapidly drew the bedclothes closer to her. Still, the presence of Monte Cristo at such an hour, his mysterious, fanciful, and extraordinary entrance into her room through the wall, might well seem impossibilities to her shattered reason. "Do not call anyone. Do not be alarmed," said the Count. "Do not let a shade of suspicion or uneasiness remain in your breast. The man standing before you, Valentine, for this time it is no ghost, is nothing more than the tenderest father, and the most respectful friend you could dream of." Valentine could not reply. The voice, which indicated the real presence of a being in the room, alarmed her so much that she feared to utter a syllable. Still, the expression of her eyes seemed to inquire, "If your intentions are pure, why are you here?" The Count's marvellous sagacity understood all that was passing in the young girl's mind. "Listen to me," he said, "or rather look upon me, look at my face, paler even than usual, and my eyes red with weariness. For 4 days I have not closed them, for I have been constantly watching you, to protect and preserve you for Maximilian." The blood mounted rapidly to the cheeks of Valentine, for the name just announced by the Count dispelled all the fear with which his presence had inspired her. "Maximilian!" she exclaimed, and so sweet did the sound appear to her that she repeated it. "Maximilian! Has he then owned all to you?" "Everything. He told me your life was his, and I have promised him that you shall live." "You have promised him that I shall live?" "Yes." "But, sir, you spoke of vigilance and protection. Are you a doctor?" "Yes, the best you can have at the present time. Believe me." "But you say you have watched," said Valentine uneasily. "Where have you been? I have not seen you." The Count extended his hand towards the library. "I was hidden behind that door," he said, "which leads into the next house, which I have rented." Valentine turned her eyes away, and, with an indignant expression of pride and modest fear, exclaimed, "Sir, I think you have been guilty of an unparalleled intrusion, and that what you call protection is more like an insult." "Valentine," he answered, "during my long watch over you, all I have observed has been what people visited you, what nourishment was prepared, and what beverage was served. Then, when the latter appeared dangerous to me, I entered as I have now done, and substituted, in the place of the poison, a healthful draught, which, instead of producing the death intended, caused life to circulate in your veins." "Poison? Death?" exclaimed Valentine, half believing herself under the influence of some feverish hallucination.
What are you saying, sir?
Hush, my child, said Monte Cristo, again placing his finger upon her lips. I did say poison and death. But drink some of this. And the Count took a bottle from his pocket, containing a red liquid, of which he poured a few drops into the glass. Drink this, and then take nothing more tonight. Valentine stretched out her hand, but scarcely had she touched the glass when she drew back in fear. Monte Cristo took the glass, drank half its contents, and then presented it to Valentine, who smiled and swallowed the rest.
"Oh, yes," she exclaimed. "I recognize the flavour of my nocturnal beverage, which refreshed me so much, and seemed to ease my aching brain. Thank you, sir. Thank you."
"This is how you have lived during the last 4 nights, Valentine," said the Count. "But oh, how I passed that time! Oh, the wretched hours I have endured, the torture to which I have submitted, when I saw the deadly poison poured into your glass, and how I trembled lest you should drink it before I could find time to throw it away."
"Sir," said Valentine at the height of her terror, "you say you endured tortures when you saw the deadly poison poured into my glass. But if you saw this, you must also have seen the person who poured it."
"Yes." Valentine raised herself in bed, and drew over her chest, which appeared whiter than snow, the embroidered cambric, still moist with the cold dews of delirium, to which were now added those of terror.
"You saw the person?"
repeated the young girl. "Yes," repeated the Count.
"What you tell me is horrible, sir. You wish to make me believe something too dreadful. What? Attempt to murder me in my father's house, in my room, on my bed of sickness? Oh, leave me, sir. You are tempting me. You make me doubt the goodness of Providence. It is impossible. It cannot be."
"Are you the first that this hand has stricken? Have you not seen Monsieur de Saint-Méran, Madame de Saint-Méran, Barrois, all fall? Would not Monsieur Noirtier also have fallen victim, had not the treatment he has been pursuing for the last 3 years neutralized the effects of the poison?"
"Oh, heaven!" said Valentine. "Is this the reason my grandpapa has made me share all his beverages during the last month?"
"And had they all tasted of a slightly bitter flavour, like that of dried orange peel?"
"Oh, yes, yes."
"Then that explains all," said Monte Cristo. "Your grandfather knows, then, that a poisoner lives here. Perhaps he even suspects the person. He has been fortifying you, his beloved child, against the fatal effects of the poison, which has failed because your system was already impregnated with it. But even this would have availed little against the more deadly medium of death employed 4 days ago, which is generally but too fatal."
"But who, then, is this assassin, this murderer?"
"Let me also ask you a question. Have you never seen any one enter into your room at night?"
"Oh, yes. I have frequently seen shadows pass close to me, approach and disappear. But I took them for visions raised by my feverish imagination, and indeed, when you entered, I thought I was under the influence of delirium."
"Then you do not know who it is that attempts your life?"
"No," said Valentine. "Who could desire my death?"
"You shall know it now, then," said Monte Cristo, listening.
"How do you mean?"
said Valentine, looking anxiously around. "Because you are not feverish or delirious tonight, but thoroughly awake. Midnight is striking, which is the hour murderers choose."
"Oh, heavens!"
exclaimed Valentine, wiping off the drops which ran down her forehead. Midnight struck slowly and sadly. Every hour seemed to strike with leaden weight upon the heart of the poor girl. "Valentine," said the Count, "summon up all your courage, still the beatings of your heart, do not let a sound escape you, and feign to be asleep. Then you will see." Valentine seized the Count's hand.
"I think I hear a noise," she said. "Leave me."
"Good-bye, for the present," replied the Count, walking upon tiptoe towards the library door, and smiling with an expression so sad and paternal that the young girl's heart was filled with gratitude. Before closing the door, he turned around once more and said, "Not a movement, not a word. Let them think you asleep, or perhaps you may be killed before I have the power of helping you." And with this fearful injunction, the Count disappeared through the door, which noiselessly closed after him. End of chapter 100.